Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the strange rituals of the ancient Samnites. What you're about to discover is that their rites weren't just for warriors, but also for soothing spirits under the moonlit skies. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Waking up in the ancient land of the Samnites is like starting your day with a cup of curiosity and a side of what on earth were they thinking. These folks, nestled in the rugged terrain of central Italy, had a flair for the dramatic that would make even the most enthusiastic theater kid blush. Picture this. You're a young Samnite lad, just hitting that age when society expects you to start playing with sticks and start proving your worth. And proving your worth, my friend, involves a rite of passage that's less sweet 16 and more. Let's see if you can survive a wolf encounter without becoming dinner. The Samnites, who thrived between 600 and 290 BCE, had a unique way of blending the mystical with the everyday. They lived in a society where economic savvy met spiritual devotion, all wrapped up in a political system that might seem oddly familiar to those of us stuck in modern bureaucratic webs. Their economic structure was firmly rooted in agriculture, with small holdings and communal pastures forming the backbone of their livelihood. You could say they were the original locavores, with a diet that consisted of whatever could be coaxed out of the rocky soil or hunted in the dense forests. Politically, the Samnites weren't exactly centralized. They were organized into federations, each with its own leader, but all bound together by a common cultural identity and shared rituals. This loose confederation enabled them to rally together when the Romans came knocking, but more on those toga-wearing expansionists later. For now, let's focus on what really set the Samnites apart, their rituals. Now, if you're imagining a simple coming-of-age ceremony involving a few words of wisdom from the village elder and maybe a modest feast, think again. The Samnite initiation rite was more Bear Grylls survival special than Grandma's advice over tea. As a young Samnite, you'd be sent into the wilderness, tasked with proving your mettle by dealing with a wolf. Yep, a real growling, sharp-toothed wolf. The idea was to either kill the beast or, in some cases, survive an encounter with one. This wasn't just about bravery. It was about embodying the qualities of the wolf: strength, cunning, and tenacity. Why wolves, you ask? Well, the Samnites had a thing for these creatures. They believed that the wolf was a totemic animal, one that symbolized the warrior spirit. In fact, the name Samnite itself is thought to derive from Sapphinies, meaning warrior or wild one. The wolf, then, was not just a danger to be vanquished, but a symbol of what the young men were supposed to become. This was less about senseless violence and more about becoming part of the pack, so to speak. But before you start sympathizing too much with these ancient daredevils, let's keep it real. This rite of passage was as much about social control as it was about personal growth. The elders who ran this show knew that a young man who could face down a wolf was one who'd likely stand firm in battle, or at least not embarrass the tribe at the next interfederation meeting. These ceremonies were a way to ensure that only the toughest, most resourceful individuals rose to prominence in Samnite society. In case you're wondering, not every young Samnite walked away with a new wolfskin cloak. The ritual was risky, and not everyone made it back. Those who did, however, were celebrated and given a place of honor among the warriors. It was a brutal way to sort the wheat from the chaff, but it was effective. And let's be honest, these were times when life was cheap and survival was costly. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds a bit like a testosterone-fueled nightmare, and you're not wrong. But remember, these were people who lived in a world where the line between the spiritual and the practical was often blurred. For the Samnites, these rites were a necessary blend of both. They believed that the will of the gods was intertwined with the fate of their people, and so every ritual had a purpose, even if that purpose involved dodging lupine jaws. So, as you sit there, perhaps sipping your latte in the comfort of the 21st century, spare a thought for those ancient Samnite youths. In a society where you were expected to run with wolves before you could even grow a full beard, life was anything but mundane. The Samnites might not have left behind towering monuments or grand philosophies, but their legacy is one of grit, resilience, and a touch of madness. A reminder that history is full of surprises, and that sometimes the past is stranger than fiction. Now, if you thought facing a wolf was the peak of Samnite audacity, hold onto your helmet because we're about to dive into the Ver Sacrum ritual, the ancient equivalent of spring cleaning. But instead of dusting off old furniture, they dedicated an entire generation of kids to Mars, the god of war. That's right, one spring every so often, they vowed all births of that season to Mars. You might think a charming gesture to the god of war, but let's peel back the layers of this onion. The Ver Sacrum wasn't just a quirky tradition to keep the gods entertained. It was deeply entwined with the Samnites' relentless expansionist ambitions. Picture this, a bunch of new recruits, all dedicated to Mars, ready to be unleashed like a Spartan boot camp on steroids. The Samnites, clever as they were, used this ritual as a strategic move to fuel their military machine. Every kid born was a future soldier ready to march off and conquer new territories once they hit adulthood. Talk about long-term planning. But the practicalities of this ritual weren't as straightforward as they might seem. Once these spring-born kids grew up, they were sent off to establish colonies, often in hostile territories. It was like sending your kid to college, but with more spears and fewer textbooks. These colonies weren't just about expansion, they were a survival strategy. With the Apennine Mountains offering more rocks than fertile soil, the Samnites had to think outside the box, or valley, in this case. They needed new lands to sustain their communities, and the Ver Sacrum was a clever way to populate these new settlements with people who had a divine mandate. But let's not get carried away with the romance of this tradition. While the idea of a god-blessed army is pretty epic, the reality was less glamorous. Life in these new colonies was brutal. The settlers faced hostile neighbors, harsh climates, and the constant challenge of establishing a foothold in foreign lands. If you think your morning commute is rough, imagine trekking through enemy territory with only a divine promise and a battle cry. And here's where we bust another myth, the noble savage image of the Samnites. History often portrays them as wild warriors living in a perpetual state of honorable combat. The truth is, they were as politically savvy and economically driven as any Roman senator in a toga. Their rituals, including the Ver Sacrum, were not just spiritual endeavors, but calculated moves on a chessboard of survival and power. The Samnites were also shrewd diplomats, using these rituals to strengthen alliances. By dedicating their offspring to Mars, they not only honored the god, but also showcased their commitment to the warrior's path. This made them formidable allies and fearsome foes. Their ability to unite under a common cause, despite being a confederation of tribes with no central authority, was a testament to their organizational skills. They could rally their forces with a speed that would make even the most efficient corporate team-building exercise look like a snail's race. In economic terms, the Ver Sacrum was a masterstroke. By sending their young to establish new territories, they relieved pressure on local resources, which were about as abundant as water in the Sahara. This ritual kept their society ticking along, balancing population growth with resource availability. And let's not forget, in a world without Netflix or social media, territorial expansion was the ultimate form of entertainment and prestige. So, as we dismantle the myth of the noble savage, let's give a nod to the gritty reality of the Samnites' survival strategies. These rituals were not just about appeasing the gods or indulging in some warrior cosplay. They were about ensuring that the Samnite culture not only survived, but thrived in a world where the stakes were high, and life was anything but certain. Now, before we wrap up this warrior's tale, let's leave a question hanging in the air. How did the Samnites fare when they finally crossed paths with the Roman juggernaut? Stay tuned, because while the Samnites might have danced with wolves and sent their kids off in service to Mars, the real test of their mettle was yet to come. But before the Samnites could butt heads with Rome's legions, they were busy putting on religious ceremonies that would make even the most extravagant Broadway production seem like a middle school play. Welcome to the world of Samnite religious rituals, where the divine meets the dramatic and animal sacrifices are just the beginning. If you thought modern religion could be intense, wait until you hear what these ancient folks were up to. First off, let's talk about the sacrifices. We're not just slicing some celery here. We're talking full-blown animal sacrifices that would have pet her up in arms faster than you can say, sacred cow. The Samnites believed that the guards had a taste for blood, and they weren't going to skimp on the quality. Bulls, goats, and sometimes even whole herds were paraded to altars, their fates sealed as offerings to the deities. Think of it as a divine barbecue with high stakes, pun intended. Now, the economic implications of these sacrifices were as hefty as the animals themselves. Offering up a bull wasn't just a casual affair, it was a significant financial decision. A single bull could cost as much as a skilled laborer's annual wage, making it a sacrifice that screamed opulence. Why not just offer a chicken, you ask? Well, a chicken was more of a token gesture. Think of it as the religious equivalent of bringing a dollar store gift to a high-end party. The guards, much like the elite Samnite warriors, expected nothing short of a feast. It wasn't just about flaunting wealth or piety, though. These sacrifices reinforced social hierarchies. The elites, who could afford to offer bulls, stood out as both religious and political leaders. The more lavish the sacrifice, the more divine favor they claimed to possess. It's a bit like ancient social media, only instead of likes and followers, you had divine favor and social standing. Speaking of grand gestures, some of these rituals might have inspired the horror genre. Picture a priest, decked out in ceremonial garb, chanting incantations as the blood of a freshly sacrificed bull flowed into a sacred trough. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of incense and iron, a sensory overload that was as much about instilling awe as it was about appeasing the gods. If that sounds like a scene from a cult classic, you're not far off. These ceremonies were designed to captivate and control, ensuring that the masses knew who held the divine heartline. But what were these rituals really about? More than just appeasing the gods, they were a political tool. By offering sacrifices, leaders reinforced their status and justified their actions, including warfare. Claiming divine support for military campaigns was like having a celestial endorsement deal. After all, if Mars himself was on your side, who could argue with your decision to march an army into enemy territory? Here's a fun fact to chew on. The cost of a single bull sacrifice could fund a small military expedition. So, when the Samnites splurged on these offerings, they weren't just making a religious statement. They were making a strategic investment. By aligning themselves with the divine, they secured the loyalty of their warriors and the support of their people. It was a clever mix of faith and finance, a reminder that even in ancient times, money talked. These rituals also played a crucial role in maintaining social order. By channeling the community's resources into collective religious practices, the Samnites fostered a sense of unity and purpose. It was a way to bind people together under a common cause, ensuring that the social fabric remained intact even amidst the chaos of expansionist ambitions. Now, let's debunk a popular myth, the notion that these ceremonies were purely spiritual affairs. While the religious aspect cannot be denied, the reality was far more pragmatic. The Samnites used these rituals to consolidate power, control resources, and justify their actions. They were masters at blurring the lines between the sacred and the strategic, ensuring that every sacrifice served both the gods and their own earthly agendas. In the grand scheme of things, the Samnites were not unlike modern politicians, using every tool at their disposal to maintain power and control. Their religious ceremonies might have been spectacles worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster, but beneath the surface lay a web of economic and political motives that kept their society in check. It's a testament to their savvy that they managed to walk this tightrope for as long as they did, balancing divine appeasement with diplomatic maneuvering. So, as you mull over the idea of a bull sacrifice doubling as a political strategy, remember this. The Samnites were not just warriors and priests. They were economists, politicians, and strategists. They understood that in a world where survival depended on the favor of the gods and the strength of your allies, every ritual was a calculated move on the chessboard of history. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Samnites is far from over. We've still got their encounters with the Romans to dissect, and trust me, that's a showdown you won't want to miss. Just as the Samnites were perfecting their ritualistic spectacle, the Romans were busy expanding their empire, like a toddler on a sugar rush grabbing every toy within reach. Enter the Samnite Wars, a trilogy of conflicts so intense they'd make a Hollywood director salivate. These wars, spanning from 343 to 290 BCE, were not just about territory. They were a clash of cultures, economies, and egos. To understand the Samnite Wars, you have to appreciate the geopolitical chessboard of the time. The Romans, having just polished off their neighbors in Latium, were looking to flex their newfound muscle. Standing in their path were the Samnites, rugged hill folk who had perfected the art of guerrilla warfare. The Samnites weren't interested in Roman-style urban sprawl. They preferred their rugged highlands and decentralized power structure. Picture them as the scrappy underdogs in a sports movie, but with more spears and fewer pep talks. First Samnite War kicked off in 343 BCE over a little place called Capua. The Capuans, having bitten off more than they could chew in a local dispute, called in the Romans for backup. The Samnites, not thrilled with Roman boots on their turf, decided it was go time. The war was brief, more of a skirmish than a full-on brawl, and ended with a peace treaty that was about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. The Romans claimed a win, but it was more of a draw if we're being honest. Fast forward a few years, and the Second Samnite War erupts in 326 BCE. This time, it was like someone took the gloves off. The Samnites, with their home field advantage, handed the Romans a stunning defeat at the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE. Imagine being a proud Roman soldier, all geared up and ready to rumble, only to find yourself stuck in a mountain pass, surrounded and forced to walk under a yoke. A humiliating rite of passage the Samnites cooked up to rub salt in the wound. It was a PR nightmare for Rome, akin to losing the Super Bowl in a landslide. But the Romans, ever the stubborn bunch, weren't about to let one embarrassing defeat start their expansion plans. They regrouped, adapted, and over the next few years chipped away at Samnite territory. The Samnites, despite their fierce independence, struggled to match Rome's resources and military machine. The war dragged on until 304 BCE, when the Samnites, exhausted and outmatched, were forced to negotiate peace again. The third and final act came in 298 BCE. The Samnites, refusing to go quietly into the night, rallied for one last stand. This time, they teamed up with other Italian tribes who weren't thrilled about Roman hegemony. It was like the Avengers of ancient Italy, but with more infighting and less CGI. This coalition managed to hold out until the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE, where the Romans finally delivered a crushing blow. The Samnites were defeated, and their power waned, though they continued to resist sporadically until 290 BCE. So, what role did those elaborate rituals play in all this? Well, they were the glue holding the Samnite Confederation together. These ceremonies weren't just religious obligations, they were rallying cries. The verse sacrum, for example, wasn't merely about appeasing Mars. It was a call to arms, a way to unify the Samnites under a common cause. The initiation rites, where young men proved their mettle against wolves, ensured a steady supply of warriors ready to defend their homeland. These traditions fostered a strong sense of identity and cohesion, critical in the face of Roman aggression. Yet, as the wars dragged on, these rituals began to lose their potency. The harsh reality was that the Samnites, with their decentralized power and limited resources, couldn't keep up with the Roman juggernaut. The Romans, with their efficient legions and superior logistics, were like a well-oiled machine, while the Samnites relied on hit-and-run tactics and local knowledge. It was a classic story of David versus Goliath, only this time Goliath had better roads and a bigger army. As the Romans tightened their grip on the Italian peninsula, the Samnites faced a stark choice: adapt or fade into obscurity. The cultural exchanges, or clashes, between the two were inevitable. The Romans, impressed by Samnite military prowess, incorporated some of their tactics and even elements of their armor into the legions. Meanwhile, the Samnites, now under Roman rule, found their traditional practices slowly eroding. The verse sacrum became less frequent, and the grand sacrifices dwindled as Roman economic systems took hold. Economically, the Samnites had to adjust to Roman taxation and land redistribution. Their communal pastures and small holdings were gradually supplanted by Roman-style estates. The Romans, ever the efficient administrators, imposed their legal and economic systems, reshaping the Samnite landscape. In a world where money talked, the Samnites found themselves learning a new language, one where Roman coinage and commerce took precedence over traditional barter and trade. Socially, the blending of cultures was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought new opportunities and access to the broader Roman economy. On the other, it diluted the distinct Samnite identity. The younger generation, growing up under Roman influence, began adopting Roman customs, clothing, and even language. It was cultural assimilation at its finest, or worst, depending on your perspective. Yet, let's not romanticize the idea of a peaceful cultural exchange. The process was anything but smooth. There were tensions, rebellions, and resistance from Samnite factions unwilling to give up their way of life. The allure of Roman citizenship and the benefits it brought was not enough to convince every Samnite to fall in line. For many, the loss of autonomy and tradition was a bitter pill to swallow. As the dust settled on the Samnite wars, the once proud confederation found itself a part of the Roman Republic. Their rituals, once the lifeblood of Samnite society, were relegated to the annals of history, curiosities studied by future generations rather than the powerful unifying forces they once were. But before we wrap up this saga, let's leave a tantalizing thread for next time. How did the Samnites adapt to life under Roman rule, and what remnants of their culture managed to survive in this new world order? Stay tuned, because while the Samnites might have lost the war, their story is far from over. The Samnites, now under the Roman thumb, faced the challenge of redefining their identity in a world that demanded conformity, yet secretly admired their rugged independence. You could say it was like trying to sell punk rock to a classical music aficionado, awkward, but with a rebellious charm that left a lasting impression. First, let's tackle the elephant, or should I say, the wolf in the room, their beloved rituals. Those wolf encounter rites that once turned boys into men. Well, the Romans had a slightly less dramatic approach to coming of age, preferring toga ceremonies and the occasional philosophical discourse over fang-filled face-offs. Gradually, the Samnites' wolfy ways became more of a legendary tale told at gatherings, kind of like your uncle's questionable fishing stories, rather than a rite of passage. Now, remember the verse sacrum. It was a plan so ambitious it could have been a startup pitch. Dedicate your offspring to Mars, send them off to conquer, and watch your territory expand. But the Romans, with their knack for paperwork and census staking, found this a bit too chaotic. They had their own ways of handling population booms, usually involving colonization plans that required less divine intervention and more Roman roads. However, the concept of dedicating youth to a cause wasn't entirely lost. The Roman legions were chock full of recruits eager to earn their citizenship through service, a secular twist on the Samnites' sacred vow. And those grandiose sacrificial ceremonies, the Romans, ever the pragmatists, saw more value in taxes than in spilling bull's blood. While public spectacles stayed in vogue, think gladiator games and chariot races, the religious fervor took a backseat to civic duty. Yet, the idea of using rituals as a political tool didn't disappear. Roman politicians became masters at orchestrating public events to curry favor with the masses, turning spectacle into strategy. The Samnites might have hung up their ceremonial garb, but their knack for theatrical influence found new life in Roman arenas. Economically, the Samnites had to navigate the choppy waters of Roman taxation and land ownership. Their small holdings and communal pastures were gradually swallowed by Roman villa estates. Imagine trading your beloved family farm for a seat at the Roman banquet table. Not exactly an even swap, but it came with perks like better infrastructure and access to Roman markets. The Samnites had to adapt or risk being left behind, a harsh reality that turned many into savvy merchants and landowners within the Roman economy. Politically, the Samnites found themselves playing a new game. Gone were the days of tribal federations. Now it was all about climbing the Roman social ladder. Some managed to secure influential positions within the Roman administration, proving that even in defeat, the Samnites had a knack for survival. They learned to speak Latin, dress in Roman style, and adopt Roman customs, slowly blending into the larger tapestry of the empire. It was cultural assimilation, sure, but with a Samnite twist, like adding a splash of mountain grit to the smooth Roman wine. So, did the Samnites' strange rituals signal their downfall, or were they a hidden strength? In truth, they were both. The rituals were a source of unity and identity, galvanizing the Samnites in times of conflict. But when faced with Rome's unstoppable expansion, their decentralized and ritual-driven society struggled to compete with the efficient Roman juggernaut. The Samnites' real legacy lies in their resilience and adaptability. They may not have conquered Rome, but they found ways to thrive within it, influencing the very culture that absorbed them. Fast forward to today, and you might be wondering if any traces of the Samnites still exist. The answer is a resounding yes, albeit in subtle ways. The regions they once inhabited, like Campania and Samnium, still bear traces of their influence, from place names to archaeological sites. And while you won't find any modern-day Samnite wolf tamers, the spirit of their independence and resourcefulness lives on in the Italian psyche, a fondness for local traditions, a love of community, and a healthy skepticism of centralized authority. In pop culture, the Samnites occasionally make appearances as the rugged underdogs in tales of ancient Italy. Their legacy, though not as grand as Rome's, is a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt and endure. The Samnites remind us that history is not just about the victors and their monuments, but also about the stories of those who dared to be different, who lived fiercely and left an indelible mark on the world around them. So, as you ponder the Samnites' place in history, remember that legacy is not just about what you build, but how you live. The Samnites lived boldly, danced with wolves, and challenged the might of Rome. They might not have built an empire, but they left behind a legacy of resilience and ingenuity, a reminder that sometimes the real victory lies in the stories we tell and the spirit we pass on to future generations. In the bustling port city of Pisa, Italy, where the riverside buildings seem to lean into each other like old friends sharing secrets, a boy named Galileo Galilei was born on February 15, 1564. Now, Pisa was already famous for its precariously tilted tower, but little did anyone know that this newborn would eventually do his own tilting against the towering intellectual traditions of his time. Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and a theorist who had an ear for melody and an eye on the family purse. You see, Vincenzo wasn't just plucking strings. He was also strumming the economic realities of the day, believing that science and music should be guided by reason rather than tradition. As Galileo grew, his father's pragmatic views seeped into the young boy's thinking like ink into parchment. Vincenzo wasn't one to romanticize the starving artist lifestyle. He understood that while a symphony could stir the soul, it couldn't fill a stomach, and he often reminded Galileo of the fine balance between passion and practicality. This blend of art and arithmetic, of sentiment and sense, would later shape Galileo's own analytical approach to the universe. But before Galileo could unravel the cosmos, he had to navigate his family's financial constraints. Money was tighter than a lute string in the Galilei household, and Vincenzo, ever the savvy strategist, hoped his son would pursue a lucrative career in medicine. So, off to the University of Pisa went young Galileo in 1581, probably more interested in dissecting the mysteries of the stars than the ailments of the human body. At the university, Galileo quickly made a name for himself as a bit of a rebel, intellectually speaking, that is. The academic world at the time was steeped in Aristotelian philosophy, which was about as flexible as the Leaning Tower's foundation. Aristotle's ideas had been the gospel truth for nearly 2 millennia, and challenging them was akin to suggesting that the Earth might not be the center of the universe, a notion that would later land Galileo in some hot water, but that's a saga for another day. Now, let's talk about that famous story involving Galileo and the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's said that in the late 16th century, Galileo conducted an experiment by dropping 2 spheres of different masses from the tower to demonstrate that their time of descent was independent of their mass. While this tale is more legendary than likely true, it perfectly encapsulates Galileo's penchant for questioning established norms. The story goes that a crowd gathered beneath the tower, possibly more interested in the spectacle than in Newtonian physics. Not that anyone knew who Newton was yet, but you get the point. The truth is, there's no solid evidence to confirm the Leaning Tower experiment actually happened as described. Some historians suggest it might have been a thought experiment or simply a teaching tool to illustrate Galileo's ideas. But whether fact or fable, it highlights Galileo's rebellious streak, a willingness to drop the proverbial ball on outdated beliefs and watch them crash to the ground, figuratively speaking. What we do know for certain is that Galileo's early experiments were instrumental in challenging the Aristotelian orthodoxy. He began investigating the laws of motion, conducting experiments with inclined planes, and timing the rolling of balls with water clocks. These experiments were pivotal in laying the groundwork for what would later become classical mechanics. So, while the image of Galileo atop the Leaning Tower, spheres in hand, is a bit of a romanticized myth, it speaks to the spirit of an age on the cusp of scientific revolution, a time when the courage to question was as vital as the courage to believe. And in Galileo's case, it was the courage to believe in the power of observation and experimentation over blind adherence to tradition. As he stood at the crossroads of old and new, the young Galileo was already leaning toward a future where the world would be understood not through ancient texts, but through empirical evidence. And that, my friends, is how legends and sometimes myths are made. Now, as Galileo stood at the threshold of a new era, he wasn't just leaning toward the future, he was practically sprinting toward it. By 1592, he found himself in Padua, a city that was like the Silicon Valley of the Renaissance, if Silicon Valley had a lot more plague and a lot less Wi-Fi. Galileo took a job at the University of Padua, where he would spend the next 18 years teaching geometry, astronomy, and military fortifications. Talk about a Renaissance man. His schedule was as packed as a Venetian gondola, but unlike the serenading gondoliers, Galileo's tunes were all about the harmony of the spheres and the geometry of the universe. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of Galileo's time at Padua. Teaching was his bread and butter, or perhaps more accurately, his pasta and olive oil. The university paid him 180 florins a year, which wasn't exactly making it rain, but it was enough to keep the lights on, so to speak. But Galileo wasn't one to rely solely on a professor's meager salary. Enter the military compass, his brainchild and a marvel of mathematical innovation. This wasn't your average compass that points north and helps you avoid getting lost in the woods. No, Galileo's military compass was more like the Swiss Army knife of the 16th century. It could calculate artillery trajectories, measure angles, and even help you divvy up land, because who doesn't love a good piece of real estate? This invention was a game changer, not just for soldiers, but also for merchants and engineers. And let's be real here, it was also a game changer for Galileo's wallet. He sold these compasses like hotcakes, and even wrote a manual on how to use them, adding a little extra flair to his already impressive resume. But life isn't all about work, right? Let's talk about Galileo's personal life, which was as colorful as a Renaissance fresco. He had 3 children with Marina Gamba, who was something of a common law wife, though the idea of common law might be stretching it a bit in the context of 16th century Italy. Galileo never married Marina, which might sound scandalous, but hey, he was a man of science, not convention. Their relationship was more of an intellectual partnership than a romantic fairy tale. Marina gave birth to 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia, and a son, Vincenzo, named after Galileo's father. And while Galileo loved his children, he wasn't exactly father of the year material. Virginia and Livia ended up in a convent, because in those days, a convent was a convenient solution for daughters who might otherwise complicate a bachelor's lifestyle. Now, you might be wondering how Galileo managed to juggle his teaching, inventions, and family life. The truth is, he was a master multitasker, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a dash of financial necessity. His reputation as a thinker and inventor was growing faster than the beard on a philosopher. Word of his talents reached even the ears of the Venetian Senate, who were so impressed they doubled his salary in 1609. Charging. This pay raise couldn't have come at a better time, because Galileo was about to embark on a journey that would change the course of history. His move to Padua and the subsequent years spent there set the stage for his astronomical discoveries, which would soon have him staring at the stars. And not just because he was avoiding eye contact with the university's bursar. Galileo was on the brink of turning his telescope skyward, ready to challenge the very heavens and the ancient ideas that governed them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In Padua, Galileo was more than just a teacher and inventor. He was a man of the world, albeit one who preferred the mathematical kind. His lectures were packed with students eager to learn from a master who was as much a performer as he was a professor, came for the education but stayed for the spectacle. as Galileo had a knack for turning complex theories into captivating stories, a skill that would serve him well when he began to share his celestial findings. Yet, despite his growing fame, Galileo remained a man of contradictions. He was a rebel who cherished tradition, a bachelor who was a devoted family man, and a scientist who saw the poetry in numbers. As he continued to teach, invent, and father his children, Galileo's life in Padua became a microcosm of the larger world he was about to explore. The stars were calling, and Galileo was getting ready to answer, one revolutionary discovery at a time. So, as we leave him here in Padua, juggling compasses, chalkboards, and family dinners, remember that Galileo was more than just a figure in a textbook. He was a man on a mission, driven by a desire to understand the universe and his place in it, one calculated step at a time. And while his journey was far from over, the seeds he planted in Padua would soon grow into a legacy that would forever alter our understanding of the cosmos. Stay tuned, because the sky is about to get a whole lot more interesting. As Galileo stood poised on the precipice of astronomical discovery, his curiosity was as insatiable as a Renaissance buffet-goer faced with an endless spread of cheeses. The year was 1609, and Galileo had just heard whispers of a peculiar Dutch invention, a contraption of lenses that could bring distant objects frighteningly close. The telescope, or spyglass, as it was then known, was causing quite the stir. But here's the twist. Galileo didn't invent the telescope. Nope, that honor goes to Hans Lippershey, a spectacle maker from the Netherlands who, in 1608, thought, what if I take these reading glasses and stack them in a tube? Still, leave it to Galileo to take a good idea and make it great. Galileo got his hands on one of these optical marvels, and with an ingenuity that would make even a modern-day tech mogul nod in approval, he set about tweaking it. By the time he was through, his version could magnify objects about 20 times their original size. Not bad for a guy working without the benefit of CAD software or YouTube tutorials. Armed with this enhanced telescope, Galileo did what any self-respecting scientist would do. He pointed it not at the ground to spy on neighbors, but at the heavens. What he saw would change the course of science forever. In January 1610, Galileo turned his telescope towards Jupiter, that giant gaseous ball of a planet that seemed to float serenely in the night sky. But wait, what were those tiny darts dancing around it? Galileo counted 4 of them, and over the next few nights he watched as they moved in a way that could only mean one thing: they were orbiting Jupiter. These weren't just twinkling stars. They were moons, real moons, whirling around the planet like celestial dancers. Naming these moons was an opportunity Galileo wouldn't squander. This was the Renaissance, after all, where patronage was as crucial as a good pair of tights. In a move that was part strategic genius and part shameless flattery, Galileo named them the Medicean stars, in honor of the powerful Medici family. Specifically, he dedicated them to Cosimo Roman II de Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, his former student and a potential benefactor. Talk about knowing how to play the game. These moons would later be known as Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, but not before they helped Galileo secure a cushy position as the Duke's chief mathematician and philosopher. Charging indeed. Now, why were these moons such a big deal? Well, in a world where the Earth was considered the center of everything, an idea backed by the Church and Ptolemy alike, Galileo's discovery was like a cosmic slap in the face. If moons could orbit Jupiter, then maybe, just maybe, not everything had to revolve around Earth. This observation provided tangible support for the heliocentric model proposed by Copernicus, suggesting that, contrary to centuries of dogma, the Earth might actually orbit the Sun. Cue the dramatic music. Of course, this was a time when challenging the geocentric model was akin to saying the Earth might be round in the Flat Earth Society. The Church wasn't exactly thrilled with Galileo's discoveries. Theological doctrines and celestial observations had been cozy bedfellows for centuries, and Galileo's findings threatened to upend that relationship faster than a game of musical chairs, a bishop's banquet. The implications were huge. If the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, what did that say about humanity's place in God's grand design? Enter the political and ecclesiastical pressures that would dog Galileo for the rest of his life. While some scholars welcomed his findings with the enthusiasm of a toddler seeing a puppy, Others were less than impressed. The Catholic Church, in particular, found itself in a bit of a quandary. How to reconcile these new astronomical observations with the scriptural interpretations that had held sway for centuries? It was a theological and political minefield, and Galileo was tap dancing right in the middle of it. But our man Galileo wasn't one to back down easily. He had a knack for the witty retort, once famously quipping, "E per si muove," or "and yet it moves," regarding the Earth, though this phrase is more legend than verified quote. His letters and writings bristled with the kind of intellectual sass that would make even a modern-day Twitter thread blush. Still, he was walking a fine line, trying to balance his revolutionary science with the need to avoid becoming the Church's next pyrotechnic display. Galileo's observations were more than just a scientific breakthrough. They were a clarion call for a new age of reason, a time when observation and evidence would take center stage, rather than dogma and tradition. Despite the pressures and the politics, Galileo remained undeterred, driven by a desire to understand the cosmos and our place within it. He knew he was onto something big, and like a scientist with a secret, he was eager to share it with the world. So there you have it, folks. Galileo Galilei, the man who turned a telescope to the skies and saw not just the stars, but the future. A future where the universe was vast, mysterious, and infinitely more complex than anyone had dared to dream. And as Galileo's story continues, with more discoveries and inevitable controversies, one thing remains clear. He was a force of nature in his own right, a trailblazer whose legacy would illuminate the path for generations to come. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in Galileo's life is about to unfold, with even more twists, turns, and celestial revelations. Galileo's story was far from over, and what came next would feel like a courtroom drama with all the ecclesiastical bells and whistles. We're talking about the trial of 1633, where Galileo found himself in the heart seat, not for the first time, but certainly the most pivotal. Imagine the scene: Rome, the eternal city, in all its Baroque splendor, as the backdrop for a showdown between science and religion that would echo through the annals of history. The Church, with its time-honored traditions and celestial certainties, was in no mood for Galileo's cosmic revelations. You see, Galileo's support for the heliocentric model, that pesky idea that Earth was not the universe's VIP lounge, had ruffled quite a few cassocks. The Catholic Church, ever the guardian of geocentric orthodoxy, saw Galileo's work as a direct challenge to its authority and interpretation of Scripture. So they sent him a not-so-friendly invitation to chat, with the Inquisition as their version of a bouncer. Here's the scoop. Galileo was charged with heresy, a term that in the 17th century carried more weight than a leaden telescope. The Church argued that his support for the Copernican model was not only scientifically dubious, but also theologically dangerous. After all, if Earth wasn't the center of everything, what did that say about mankind's special place in the divine scheme? Cue the existential dread. In April 1633, Galileo stood before the Roman Inquisition, armed with a defense that was, let's be honest, less than airtight. The Church charged him with vehement suspicion of heresy, which sounds like something a paranoid neighbor might accuse you of after you borrow their lawnmower one too many times. But this was no neighborly dispute. It was a matter of cosmic significance. Galileo's defense strategy was akin to a chef trying to explain why he added chili to a traditional spaghetti bolognese. Not exactly a crowd pleaser. He argued that his writings on heliocentrism were merely theoretical, a what-if scenario rather than a this-is-it proclamation. But the Inquisition wasn't buying it. They saw Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, published in 1632, as a thinly veiled endorsement of Copernican cosmology. And then there's the juicy bit about E per si muove. And yet it moves. Legend has it that Galileo muttered this defiant whisper under his breath after being forced to recant his heliocentric beliefs. It's the kind of story that makes for great drama, but let's face it, the evidence for this moment is about as solid as a souffle. No contemporary accounts mention it. It only popped up over a century later. It's romantic, sure, but about as likely as Galileo having a side gig as a fortune teller. Back in the courtroom, the Inquisition was less interested in whispered defiance and more focused on a public recantation. Galileo, now 70, was in no position to play the martyr. He was a pragmatist at heart, more interested in staying alive than becoming a posthumous poster boy for science. So, he did what any sensible septuagenarian would do when faced with the threat of torture. He recanted, albeit with the reluctance of a cat being dragged to a bath. The trial concluded with Galileo's infamous abjuration on June 22, 1633. He knelt before his inquisitors in the grand hall of the convent of Minerva and declared his heliocentric assertions to be false. It was a dramatic moment, but not the end of his story. Far from it. The church sentenced him to house arrest for the rest of his life, a punishment that sounds a bit like being grounded for discovering the truth about Santa Claus. Now, let's not romanticize Galileo's house arrest as some sort of intellectual spa retreat. He was confined to his villa in Arcetri, near Florence, without the freedom to travel or publish as he pleased. It was a gilded cage, sure, but a cage nonetheless. The church monitored his correspondence, and any visitors he received were treated with suspicion, as if Galileo was harboring secrets that could unravel the fabric of the cosmos. But here's the kicker. Even under house arrest, Galileo remained as industrious as ever, like a Renaissance Mac jiver armed with quills and parchment. He continued to write, producing works that would later form the basis of modern physics. His dialogue concerning two new sciences, published in 1638, laid the groundwork for kinematics and strength of materials. It was smuggled out of Italy and published in the Netherlands, proof that you can't keep a good scientist down, even when he's technically not allowed to leave his own garden. In the grand scheme of things, Galileo's trial was more than just a clash between science and religion. It was a reflection of the broader tensions of the time. The Catholic Church, already reeling from the Protestant Reformation, was keen to maintain its grip on spiritual and intellectual authority. Galileo, with his telescopic revelations, threatened to loosen that grip, challenging the Church to reconsider long-held beliefs. In the end, Galileo's trial was as much about power as it was about planets. It was a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge often comes at a cost, and that the path to truth is rarely a straight line. Galileo's recantation may have been a blow to his pride, but it was a strategic retreat, allowing him to continue his work, albeit under restrictive circumstances. So, as we leave Galileo in his villa under the watchful eyes of the Church, remember that his story is far from over. His legacy was already taking shape, like the first brushstrokes of a masterpiece. The trial may have been a temporary setback, but it couldn't dim the light of his discoveries, a light that would guide future generations in their quest to understand the universe. Stay tuned, because the saga of Galileo Galilei is still unfolding, with more twists and turns than a Tuscan hillside road. Galileo's story was like a celestial comedy of errors, where the universe played the lead role, and the Church was the overzealous director trying to cut the best scenes. Even as he settled into life under house arrest, Galileo continued to poke at the boundaries of human understanding with the persistence of a cat, determined to fit into an undersized box. As the years wore on, the aged scientist found himself in a sort of intellectual exile, a living paradox confined to his villa, yet unbound by the limits of his mind. His greatest work during this period, Two New Sciences, was a testament to his tenacity. Written in 1638, it was effectively Galileo's swan song to the world of physics, a final, audacious act of defiance against the intellectual constraints imposed upon him. This book laid down the foundational principles of kinematics and the strength of materials. In a way, it was Galileo's way of saying, you can lock me up, but you can't lock down my ideas. And so, with the help of some cunning friends, the manuscript was smuggled out of Italy and published in the more science-friendly Netherlands. It was like sending a message in a bottle, except the bottle was a book, and the ocean was the vast divide between dogma and discovery. Now, Galileo's later years weren't all equations and clandestine publications. His health, like a poorly constructed bridge, began to show signs of serious wear and tear. By 1638, he was nearly blind, a cruel irony considering his life's work had been all about seeing the unseen. Yet he soldiered on, dictating his ideas to students and scribes with the vigor of a man half his age. When he wasn't wrestling with the laws of motion, he was hosting visitors who made the pilgrimage to Arcetri to sit at the feet of a living legend. It was a bit like a Renaissance TED talk, minus the PowerPoint slides. and exorbitant ticket prices. Galileo passed away on January 8, 1642, at the age of 77. The Church, ever vigilant in its quest to control the narrative, refused to allow him a public funeral or a marked grave. They feared his final resting place would become a shrine to scientific heresy. Little did they know, they'd merely postponed the inevitable. Galileo's legacy was already orbiting around the world, traveling faster than any ecclesiastical decree could tether it. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the Church was ready to revisit the script. In 1992, a mere 350 years after his death, Pope John Paul Roman II issued a formal acknowledgement that the Church had erred in its handling of Galileo's case. Talk about a belated apology. It's like showing up late to a party and finding out it's already over, but at least you brought a nice bottle of wine. The Pope's statement was more than just a mea culpa. It was a recognition of the enduring value of scientific inquiry and the importance of adapting age-old beliefs to new understandings. Galileo's vindication was a bittersweet reminder of the clash between innovation and tradition. His life, a tapestry woven with the threads of genius and obstinacy, was a case study in the cost of challenging the status quo. He dared to look beyond the accepted truths of his time, and for that he paid a steep price. But in the end, the truth had a way of outlasting its detractors, like a stubborn weed that refuses to be uprooted. The irony of Galileo's story is not lost on us. Here was a man who, in his pursuit of celestial mechanics, found himself ensnared by the earthly politics of his day. His trials and tribulations serve as a poignant reminder that the road to enlightenment is often paved with resistance and ridicule. Yet, it's a journey worth taking, for it's through the cracks of convention that the light of discovery often shines the brightest. In reflecting on Galileo's life, we're left with a sense of both humor and tragedy. The humor lies in the absurdity of a world that once believed the Earth was the universe's center stage, complete with celestial footlights and an audience of one. The tragedy, however, rests in the realization that even the greatest minds can be stifled by the prevailing winds of fear and ignorance. So, as we close the final chapter on Galileo Galilei, let us remember him not just as a scientist, but as a symbol of the eternal dance between curiosity and caution. His story is a testament to the power of persistence and the enduring quest for truth. And while he may have spent his final years confined to his villa, his ideas roamed free, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire those who dare to look beyond the horizon. In the grand cosmic theater, Galileo was not just a player. He was a pioneer, charting a course for future generations to follow. And that, my friends, is a legacy worthy of the stars. In the grand tapestry of human belief, where gods and myths frolic like characters in the ultimate cosmic sitcom, the Norse pantheon stands out as one of the most charismatic, and let's face it, downright peculiar casts. For the ancient Norse, the universe was a 9-tiered extravaganza, all held together by a tree that would put any California redwood to shame. Meet Yggdrasil, the mighty ash tree that spans the cosmos. Forget about your average backyard oak. Yggdrasil was the ancient Norse's version of a universal Wi-Fi router, connecting everything from the lofty realm of Asgard to the shadowy depths of Helheim. But before we get too caught up in the sprawling branches of Yggdrasil, let's take a moment to appreciate the Norse concept of these 9 realms. Each realm had its own flavor, like a cosmic buffet. We have Asgard, home to the A-list deities like Odin and Thor, perched at the top because, naturally, gods need the best views. Then there's Midgard, the middle realm, essentially the ancient Norse version of suburbia, where humans did their thing. And let's not forget Jotunheim, land of the giants, who probably spent their time grumbling about their portrayal in Norse lore, who wouldn't be annoyed at always being the bad guys. The Norse gods themselves were a colorful bunch, embodying traits that could give any modern superhero lineup a run for its money. Odin, the All-Father, was the original one-eyed wonder, trading an eye for wisdom in a move that makes you wonder if LASIK was an option. Then there's Thor, the hammer-wielding thunder god who seemed to smash things first and ask questions never. Not to be outdone, Loki, the trickster god, was the archetype of chaotic neutral, a being who could blend into any era's reality TV with ease. Of course, when you start to peel back the layers, you find that these myths weren't just entertaining tales spun around the fire on a cold Scandinavian night. They were practical, too. The Norse cosmology was like a cosmic PowerPoint presentation, illustrating the chaos and order of life. In a world where winters were harsh and unpredictable, it made sense to worship deities that mirrored those extremes. Odin's pursuit of wisdom, for instance, wasn't just academic. It was a survival guide for navigating the volatile whims of nature and society. And let's talk economics because, spoiler alert, even the Norse gods were subject to the whims of supply and demand. The myths served as a way to explain the world, sure, but they also justified the social hierarchy. Odin and his kin at the top mirrored the chieftains and warriors who ruled the human realm. The gods' tales of battles and conquests weren't just bedtime stories. They were a divine endorsement of raiding and pillaging, the economic lifeblood of the Norse world. It's a bit like if your local government funded their infrastructure projects with the backing of a Marvel movie. The political landscape, too, played into these myths. The Norse were a collection of tribes, each with its own chieftain, vying for power and resources. The gods' perpetual squabbles and alliances mirrored the political maneuverings of the Norse tribes themselves. And let's not forget the social factors. In a society where survival depended on community and kinship, the myths reinforced these values. Odin's quest for wisdom or Thor's protection of mankind weren't just stories. They were blueprints for a cohesive society, teaching values and providing social cohesion in a world that could be as harsh as a Norse winter. So, as we explore the Norse pantheon, remember that these gods weren't just figments of imagination. They were reflections of the world the Norse lived in, a world that was as brutal as it was beautiful. Next time you think of Thor swinging his hammer or Odin brooding over the fate of the cosmos, remember that these stories were as much about survival and society as they were about mythic heroism. And if you find yourself chuckling at Loki's antics, just remember, every trickster needs an audience, and the ancient Norse were more than happy to oblige. Yet, as much as the Norse myths were about dynamic deities and epic battles, they had a softer side, or perhaps a frostier one, when it came to explaining the origins of everything. Enter Ymir, the primordial giant who makes Thanos look like an amateur in the cosmic stakes. According to Norse lore, it all started in a void called Ginnungagap, a kind of cosmic waiting room. On one side, you had the fiery realm of Muspelheim, and on the other, the icy Niflheim. Picture the scene. Fire meets ice, and out of this uncomfortable cosmic cocktail emerges Ymir, the first being. No gentle creation here, folks. Ymir was born in a sweat, literally, as melting ice met flame. Talk about a hot mess. Ymir was no ordinary giant. From his armpit sweat and leg coupling sprang other giants, a budding family tree of epic proportions. But before you start picturing a heartwarming family reunion, let's cut to the chase. The gods were not fans. Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, decided Ymir was more useful dead than alive. So they did what any self-respecting divinity would do. They killed him and used his body to craft the world. Ymir's flesh became the earth, his blood the oceans, his bones the mountains, and his skull the sky. It's recycling at its most macabre, but hey, waste not, want not. This creation myth wasn't just a bedtime story to tuck the Norse into their furs at night. It was a gritty allegory for survival in a brutal landscape. The Norse lived in a world where nature could be unforgiving, a place where summer blinked and you missed it. The harshness of their environment was mirrored in their myths. Ymir's dismemberment was a cosmic explanation for the harsh realities they faced daily. Survival often came at a cost. Just as the gods had to dismantle Ymir to create order from chaos, the Norse had to contend with the unpredictability of life, from volatile weather to the threat of hunger. But what about humans, you ask? Well, the first of our kind, according to Norse tradition, came from trees. Yes, trees. Odin, Vili, and Ve stumbled upon 2 logs on a beach and decided to get creative. They shaped the logs into the first man and woman, Ask and Imblad. It's a tale that underscores the Norse penchant for resourcefulness, making the most of what's around them, even if it's driftwood. In a society where every resource counted, this tale reinforced the value of adaptability and ingenuity. The Norse didn't just admire these traits in their stories, they lived them. These myths weren't just larked away in the minds of skalds or whispered around hearth fires. They were woven into the very fabric of Norse society, influencing everything from social structure to the daily grind of Viking life. The gods' actions provided a divine blueprint for human behavior. Odin's wisdom-seeking and Thor's strength were ideals to aspire to, especially in a culture where survival was a team sport. The myths justified the societal hierarchy, echoing the cosmic order established by the gods. Just as Odin ruled from Asgard, chieftains governed the earthly realm, ensuring that the Norse way of life continued, even when the fjords froze over. Let's not romanticize this too much, though. The Norse world was as much about raid and pillage as it was about honor and loyalty. The stories reinforced these activities, giving them a divine stamp of approval. When your gods are hacking apart giants to create the world, it makes your own acts of violence and conquest seem, well, a little more noble. The economic reality was that resources were scarce, and trading, or raiding, was a way to ensure survival. The myths didn't just entertain, they validated the Norse way of life, making sure everyone knew their place in the grand scheme of things, from thralls to jarls. All this myth-making wasn't just a pastime for long winter nights. It was a social glue that held the community together, a shared narrative that everyone could get behind. In a world where kinship and loyalty were critical, these stories helped forge a collective identity. They provided a moral compass and a shared understanding of the world, even when that world seemed a little too cold for comfort. So, next time you hear about Ymir's unfortunate end, remember that his story was more than just myth. It was a reflection of the Norse experience, a saga of survival against the odds. As we delve deeper into these myths, bear in mind that the Norse weren't just spinning yarns for fun. They were doing what every society does, trying to make sense of a world that often defied understanding. Their myths were as much about explaining the unexplainable as they were about entertaining. And in a landscape as unforgiving as theirs, who could blame them for turning to the divine for a little guidance? Stay tuned, because the Norse gods and their stories have plenty more to reveal about the ancient world and its people. Now, as we dive deeper into this saga, let's tackle the Norse concept of Ragnarok, essentially the Viking version of the ultimate season finale. Picture this, the end-of-the-world narrative that's got more drama than a soap opera and more destruction than a Michael Bay film. Ragnarok wasn't just the climax of Norse mythology, it was the grand narrative arc that tied everything together. It's like they took every apocalyptic theme imaginable, tossed it into their mythic cauldron, and let it simmer until they had a bubbling pot of doom-laden prophecy. But before you start stockpiling canned goods and booking a one-way ticket to the nearest fallout shelter, let's peel back the layers of this apocalyptic onion. Ragnarok was foretold to be a cataclysmic event involving a series of natural disasters, the death of gods, and the eventual submersion of the world in water. Not exactly a day at the beach. It's the kind of story that would make even the most hardened doomsday prepper break a sweat. But here's the kicker. While the narrative was rife with destruction, it wasn't all gloom and doom. The Norse, ever the pragmatists, saw it as a cycle, a necessary cleansing that would pave the way for rebirth. It's like they were saying, sure, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, but just wait for the reboot. This narrative of destruction followed by renewal isn't unique to the Norse, but they sure knew how to put their own spin on it. The gods would meet their end in glorious battle, only for a new world to emerge from the ruins. This cycle of death and rebirth resonated deeply with the Norse, who lived in a world where life was a constant struggle against the elements. In a land where winter was less a season and more a state of being, the promise of renewal offered a glimmer of hope. It was as if Ragnarok was the Norse way of acknowledging the harsh realities of their world, while also giving a nod to the resilience of life itself. Now, let's talk about the reality check. While the dramatic flair of Ragnarok might have you picturing Vikings quaking in their boots, historical evidence suggests otherwise. The Norse weren't sitting around waiting for the end times. They were busy being, well, Vikings. Raiding, trading, farming, and building. These hardy folk weren't the kind to let a little thing like an apocalypse get in the way of their daily grind. The archaeological record shows a people more focused on survival than on impending doom. They built longhouses in the 10th century, not bunkers. Take the thing assemblies, for example. These were the Viking equivalent of a town hall meeting, where political decisions were made, disputes were settled, and laws were proclaimed. It was democracy, Norse style, long before the Greeks got all the credit. The thing was a place where everyone, from chieftains to common folk, could have their say. It was a system that balanced power and gave the people a voice, an early form of checks and balances that would make any modern political scientist nod in approval. But here's where it gets juicy. The Thing assemblies were more than just political gatherings. They were also social events, a chance for communities to come together, share news, and perhaps a mug of mead or three. It was a place where alliances were forged and disputes were aired, often with a fair bit of drama. They were the glue that held society together, ensuring order and cohesion in a world that could be as chaotic as a Norse myth. The political structures of the Norse world, as evidenced by the Thing, were deeply influenced by their beliefs. The idea of cyclical time and renewal, as seen in Ragnarok, mirrored the political turnover and renewal within their society. Chieftains could rise and fall, much like the gods in their myths. It was a system that allowed for adaptability and change, ensuring that power didn't stagnate. And in a world as unforgiving as theirs, adaptability was key. So, while the romanticism of Ragnarok paints a picture of inevitable doom, the reality was much more nuanced. The Norse were a resilient people, constantly adapting to their environment and circumstances. Their myths weren't just stories of gods and giants. They were reflections of the values and realities of their world. They were a way of making sense of a harsh existence, offering both a narrative framework and a moral compass. And let's not forget the economic angle here. The Norse economy was as reliant on raiding as it was on trading. The myth of Ragnarok, with its cycles of destruction and renewal, could be seen as a divine endorsement of this way of life. After all, if the gods themselves were destined to perish and be reborn, what better justification for a life of constant upheaval? The Norse didn't just survive, they thrived, and their myths were a testament to that resilience. In the end, the concept of Ragnarok was as much about reinforcing social and political structures as it was about mythic drama. It provided a framework for understanding the world, a narrative that offered both a warning and a promise. In a culture where the line between myth and reality was as thin as a Viking longship's hull, these stories were more than just tales. They were the bedrock of Norse society. So, as we continue to unravel the rich tapestry of Norse mythology, remember that the Vikings were more than just fearsome warriors and seafarers. They were storytellers and thinkers, people who sought to understand their world through the lens of myth. And while the allure of Ragnarok might be its apocalyptic drama, the true story is one of resilience, adaptability, and the enduring human spirit. Keep that in mind as we delve further into the Norse world, where the gods may have met their end, but the spirit of the people lived on. Stay with us as we uncover more about the ancient Norse, their beliefs, and the society they built on the edge of the known world. In the Norse world, where gods and giants duked it out in epic tales, there was another power player lurking in the wings: magic. No, we're not talking about card tricks or rabbits in hats. This was the realm of the seers and the Valva, mystics who wielded influence like ancient influencers with a knack for the mystical. These women had the uncanny ability to peer into the future, foretelling events with a confidence that would make even Nostradamus do a double take. Imagine a world where the future wasn't in your hands, but in the whispered words of a cloaked figure over a campfire. Yeah, it's a bit like relying on your daily horoscope to plan your life, except with higher stakes. The Valva, often portrayed as wise women draped in robes and mystery, were the de facto spiritual guides of Norse society. They didn't just dabble in predictions. They were the Norse equivalent of a strategic advisor with a dash of mysticism. In a society that thrived on oral tradition and storytelling, these seers were like the headline news, providing insights into everything from impending battles to the weather. And let's face it, when you're living in a landscape that can go from sunny to snowstorm faster than you can say Viking raid, having someone who could predict the future was a bit like having a Norse version of Google. Now, before you start imagining these women as fringe-dwelling outcasts, consider this: they held a significant amount of social clout. In a culture where power often came from the swing of a sword, the Valva controlled a different kind of power, the power of knowledge and foresight. They were consulted by chieftains and kings alike, their visions shaping decisions that could alter the course of history. It's like they were the ultimate consultants, except their fees involved more offerings than invoices. The influence of seers and magic wasn't just confined to the spiritual realm. It seeped into the economic and political fabric of Norse society. Picture this: a Valva predicts a bountiful harvest or a successful raiding season, boosting morale and, in turn, encouraging trade and alliances. These predictions could sway the economic tides, impacting everything from trade routes to the allocation of resources. In a world where the gods controlled the elements, having someone who could interpret their whims was invaluable. It's like having insider information on the stock market, but with more runes and fewer spreadsheets. Let's not kid ourselves, though. The appeal of the Valva wasn't just about their foresight. The mystique surrounding these figures was part of their allure. In a society where the line between myth and reality was as fluid as the fjords, belief in magic and prophecy was a comforting constant. It provided a sense of order in a world that could be as chaotic as a Loki prank. The Valva were living legends, their stories passed down through generations, a reminder that even in a harsh world, there were forces beyond human understanding. But how did these mystical practices mesh with the hard-nosed realities of Norse life? Well, in a world that thrived on trade and raiding, the seers' predictions were like celestial forecasts for economic planners. The Norse were shrewd traders, known for their far-reaching voyages across the seas, from the icy coasts of Greenland to the bustling markets of Byzantium. The predictions of a Valva could influence the launch of a trading expedition, steering ships toward prosperity or away from disaster. It's as if the Norse had their own version of a cosmic GPS, guiding them through the treacherous waters of commerce and conquest. And speaking of trade, let's not overlook the economic powerhouse that was the Norse world. By the time the Viking Age was in full swing, Norse traders had established connections that spanned continents. They traded everything from furs and amber to slaves and silver, creating a network that was as complex as any modern supply chain. The seers' influence here was subtle but significant, their predictions shaping the flow of goods and the fortunes of those who dared to navigate the perilous waters of trade. The political landscape was equally influenced by magic and prophecy. In a society where alliances were as changeable as the weather, the Valva's words could cement or dissolve pacts. A favorable prophecy might lead to a new alliance, while a grim one could spark conflict. The Norse political system, with its thing assemblies and chieftain hierarchies, was built on negotiation and power plays. The seers added another layer to this dynamic, their visions acting as a divine nod or frown from the gods themselves. But let's bust a myth here. While the Valva were revered, they weren't infallible. Their predictions, like all things in life, were subject to interpretation. And in a culture that valued both strength and cunning, the seers had to navigate a fine line between mystic and mortal. Their influence was as much about perception as it was about power, a reminder that in the Norse world, reality was often in the eye of the beholder. So, while the stories of magic and prophecy add a touch of mystique to the Norse saga, they're also a testament to the complex interplay of belief, economy, and politics. The Valva and their visions were more than just tales of wonder. They were a reflection of a society that thrived on adaptability and ingenuity. In a world where the gods could be as capricious as the North Sea, the seers provided a semblance of order, a glimpse into the unknown that guided the Norse through the storms of life, both literal and metaphorical. As we continue to explore the rich tapestry of Norse mythology and society, remember that these stories of magic and prophecy were more than just fanciful tales. They were a vital part of the Norse way of life, shaping decisions and guiding the people through the challenges of their world. So, keep your runes close and your wits about you, because the Norse saga has plenty more mysteries to unravel and myths to bust. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the world of the Vikings, where the line between myth and reality is as thin as a blade's edge, and where every story has a lesson to teach. So, as we delve into the final act of our Norse saga, it's time to tackle the grand finale, the decline of Norse paganism and the rise of Christianity. This wasn't some overnight conversion akin to swapping your phone's operating system. Nope, this was a complex, often messy, transition that took centuries and involved more negotiation than a peace treaty at the United Nations. Let's set the stage. By the late 10th century, the winds of change were blowing across Scandinavia, not just the kind that required an extra layer of furs. Christianity was making its mark, carried along trade routes, and whispered in halls where chieftains weighed its promise of unity against the old god's capricious ways. The popular narrative suggests a smooth handover from Odin to the Christian god, but that's about as accurate as describing Ragnar Lothbrok as just a nice guy. historical records, and archaeological evidence tell a more nuanced story. Conversion wasn't a simple case of out with the old, in with the new. It was a gradual blending of old beliefs and new doctrines, like mixing mead with wine, sometimes smooth, sometimes explosive. Take King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, for instance. Around the year 995, he embarked on a mission to convert his people, using persuasion, incentives, and when all else failed, a bit of good old-fashioned force. Christianity wasn't just a spiritual upgrade. It was a political tool, a means to consolidate power and align with the broader European tapestry. Now, here's where the economy comes into play. The Norse were nothing if not pragmatic, and the shift to Christianity brought with it economic perks. Aligning with Christian Europe opened trade doors wider than a Viking longhouse during a midsummer feast. Suddenly, Norse merchants had more friends to barter with, and their ships sailed not just with goods, but with new ideas. It was a trade-off, literally and metaphorically, that appealed to more than just the spiritual. But conversion didn't mean the old gods were tossed out like yesterday's leftovers. Archaeological finds, like the famous gelling stones in Denmark, reveal a fascinating blend of pagan and Christian symbols. These stones, erected by King Harold Bluetooth around 965, are like ancient billboards advertising his conversion success, yet they still nod to the Norse pantheon. It's as if the Vikings were hedging their bets, just in case Thor came back with a vengeance. And let's talk about the social ripple effects. The Thing assemblies, which we mentioned earlier, played a crucial role here. These gatherings became forums for debate, where the merits of Christianity were weighed against Norse traditions. Imagine a Norse TED talk, but with more axes and fewer PowerPoint slides. The political and social elites were often the first to convert, drawn by the promise of stability and international alliances. But for the everyday Viking farmer, conversion was a slower burn, more about practicality than divine inspiration. The romantic image of Vikings smashing through monasteries and monks cowering in fear is about as close to reality as a Norseman is to a teetotaler. Sure, there were skirmishes, and yes, some resistance was fiercer than a berserker on a bad day. But the spread of Christianity also involved negotiation, compromise, and sometimes even acceptance of syncretism. Old festivals were rechristened with new names, and Norse traditions were woven into Christian practice. The winter solstice celebration, Yule, found its way into Christmas, proving that even divine narratives can learn to share. As we draw the curtain on Norse paganism, it's crucial to highlight its enduring legacy. Norse mythology didn't vanish. It simply took on new forms. Fast forward to today, and you'll find echoes of the Viking spirit in everything from blockbuster movies to heavy metal music. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, has become a pop culture icon, wielded by superheroes on the big screen and worn as jewelry by fans of Norse lore. The Norse gods may have stepped back from the spotlight, but their stories continue to inspire, captivate, and entertain. And let's not forget the metal bands. If Odin had a soundtrack, it would probably involve electric guitars and some serious headbanging. Bands like Ammon Amarth and Bathory have kept the Viking spirit alive, mixing mythological themes with modern riffs to create anthems that would make even the most stoic Norse warrior nod in approval. It's a testament to the timeless appeal of Norse mythology, proving that while the gods may have left the stage, their legacy rocks on. So, what's the takeaway from this Norse saga? It's a reminder that history is rarely as simple as it seems. The decline of Norse paganism and the rise of Christianity wasn't a clean break, but a complex dance of beliefs, politics, and practicality. It reflects the resilience of human culture, the ability to adapt and evolve while holding onto the threads of our past. Whether it's through tales of thunder gods or the rhythm of a metal anthem, the Norse spirit endures, a testament to a people who dared to sail beyond the horizon and left a legacy as enduring as the northern lights. Before the roosters even thought about crowing, you're already awake, feeling the weight of another day as a medieval blacksmith. The sun isn't up yet, but you can bet your last groat that the fire in your forge is. Fire is your lifeline, your confidant, and frankly, your most demanding co-worker. It's got a personality as fiery as its name suggests, and it needs constant feeding. This isn't some romantic bonfire where you toast marshmallows and tell tales of yore. This is a roaring beast that demands attention, and your job is to keep it happy. In fact, Your day doesn't start with a stretch and a yawn, but with a quick shuffle to check if the embers are still glowing. Your first task each morning is to stoke the flames. You know that without fire, you're just a person with a hammer and a dream. Bellows in hand, you pump rhythmically, coaxing the fire to life like you're playing an ancient bagpipe solo. And let me tell you, this is no gentle serenade. It's more of a heavy metal concert for one. Bellows are those massive leather lungs that breathe life into the forge, and they're about as subtle as a Viking war cry. Once the fire's raging, you look around your smithy, a space that's less quaint medieval workshop and more gritty industrial hub. Anvils, hammers, tongs, and chisels clutter every surface like a blacksmith's version of a teenager's bedroom. Each tool has its own purpose and personality, much like the fire you've just wrangled. Now, let's talk calories. You're burning through them like a medieval marathoner. A blacksmith's day is essentially one long, sweaty workout, minus the designer gym gear and the fruit smoothies. You might be surprised to hear that you could be burning around 5,000 calories a day. That's roughly equivalent to running a marathon. But instead of a medal, your reward is the satisfaction of crafting the tools and weapons that keep your community running, and maybe a pint of ale if you're lucky. Speaking of community, your economic impact is no small change. You're the medieval equivalent of a local tech startup, vital to the infrastructure of any town or village. From plowshares to horseshoes to weapons, your work keeps the wheels of medieval society turning. The local economy revolves around the goods you produce, and without you, the fields go unplowed, the horses limp, and the knights swing their swords like blunt instruments. Now, let's debunk a myth or two, because let's face it, medieval life gets a bad rap when it comes to hygiene. Sure, you're not showering daily with water from an Icelandic glacier, but you're not wallowing in filth either. You make do with what you have, and that often means a basin and a cloth. It's not glamorous, but the medieval world wasn't a cesspool of dirt and disease, except for, the whole plague thing. You're aware of cleanliness, at least enough to keep the worst of the grime at bay. After all, if you're too filthy, nobody wants to be around you, especially when you're swinging a hammer. So, as you pull on your leather apron and prepare to face the day, you're not just a blacksmith. You're the backbone of medieval industry, the unsung hero of everyday life, and the reason your village hasn't descended into a chaotic mess of broken tools and unshod horses. It's a grind, sure, but it's your grind, and it's essential to the community. Besides, who needs a gym membership when you've got a forge and a set of bellows? You're not just hammering away at metal, you're hammering out your place in the social hierarchy of the Middle Ages. Blacksmiths like you were the rock stars of the working world, minus the groupies and questionable fashion choices. Your role was crucial in both urban and rural settings, and you were often more than just the guy who made horseshoes. You were the community's Mr. Fix-It, the goda for everything from plowshares to intricate iron gates. While the local lord might be sitting pretty in his castle, it's folks like you who keep his estate running smoothly. Your skills were so essential that in some places, blacksmiths were even exempt from certain taxes, an ancient version of getting a little love from the IRS. Now, let's talk about the guild system, which was essentially the medieval LinkedIn, but with more hammers and fewer motivational quotes. Guilds were organizations that set the standards for everything from pricing to the quality of work. They were the arbiters of who got to call themselves a master smith and who was just a wannabe with a hammer. Joining a guild wasn't just about networking. It was about protecting your livelihood. If you were in, you had a sort of medieval insurance policy that helped you and your family in times of need. But getting into the guild wasn't a walk in the park or the jousting tournament. You typically start as an apprentice, a role that was part education, part servitude. Imagine being a teenager, but instead of flipping burgers, you're flipping red-hot iron. For about 7 years, you'd learn the ropes, or rather, the tongs and anvils. During this time, you'd live with your master, who would teach you everything you needed to know, from basic hammering techniques to the finer points of metallurgy. If you managed to survive the apprenticeship without burning down the forge or accidentally creating a medieval version of a modern art piece, you graduate to journeyman status. As a journeyman, you could finally earn wages for your work, but don't go thinking you're rolling in florins just yet. You still had to produce a masterpiece that would be judged by the guild. Pass the test, and you're a master. Fail, and it's back to the anvil for you. This masterpiece wasn't just any old horseshoe. It had to be a showstopper, the kind of thing that would make other blacksmiths nod in grudging respect. It was your ticket to setting up your own shop, hiring apprentices, eventually becoming a respected member of the community, or at least someone who didn't have to eat boiled cabbage for dinner every night. Let's debunk some myths while we're at it. Medieval technology wasn't just knights and castles. Sure, those are the headliners, but let's give a shout-out to lesser-known innovations that blacksmiths played a role in. For instance, the development of the blast furnace in the late Middle Ages was a game-changer, enabling the production of cast iron. This was basically the medieval equivalent of discovering you can microwave your instant noodles instead of boiling them, time-saving and a little life-changing. And while we're at it, the image of knights in shining armor owes a lot to blacksmiths. Those intricate suits of armor didn't just appear out of thin air. They were the result of countless hours of labor, skill, and a whole lot of sweat. We're talking about armor so well crafted that it could withstand a serious beating. If you ever wondered why blacksmiths had strong arms, now you know. Each piece had to be custom-made, fitted to the knight's body like a bespoke suit. You were essentially the Savile Row of the medieval battlefield. Now, the romantic notion that medieval blacksmiths were isolated, hammering away in solitude, couldn't be further from the truth. You were smack dab in the middle of the social tapestry, a key player in community events, and sometimes even a bit of a gossip hub. People came to your forge not just for metalwork, but for news, advice, and a good old-fashioned chat. You were the barber shop of the Middle Ages, minus the haircuts, but full of hot air and harder metal. In cities, blacksmiths were often located near marketplaces, the centers of commerce and social interaction. Here, your role expanded beyond just the utilitarian. You might be crafting decorative ironwork to adorn the homes of the affluent, or creating tools for specialized trades. In rural areas, blacksmiths were equally indispensable, ensuring the agriculture machinery was in top shape. Because let's face it, a broken plowshare during planting season is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Economically, your work was the backbone of business. No forge meant no tools, and subsequently no production. Your craftsmanship was a form of currency, an essential component in the barter system that prevailed before the widespread use of cash. This wasn't just about making ends meet. It was about ensuring the survival and prosperity of your community. You were the quiet force behind the agricultural and military might of the time, the unsung hero in a world that often sang the praises of kings and knights. So, as you hammer away, consider this. You're not just shaping metal. You're shaping history, one horseshoe and sword at a time. The forge is your stage, the anvil your instrument, and in the grand symphony of medieval life, you play a note that resonates through the ages. Remember, the next time you're sweating over a piece of stubborn iron, you're not just a blacksmith, you're a legend in the making. So you've got your hands full, quite literally, with metal shaping and a sprinkle of legend making. But let's shift our gaze to what you're actually crafting in that fiery den of yours. We're talking swords, plowshares, and those nifty little domestic items that make life in the Middle Ages slightly less brutal. You know, the stuff that would make a medieval Martha Stewart nod in approval. Let's start with the bread and butter of your trade, weapons. Now, don't go thinking you're just cranking out swords like some medieval assembly line. Each blade is a bespoke creation, a handcrafted marvel that knights would trust with their lives, and let's be honest, their egos. Crafting a sword isn't just about whacking a chunk of metal into submission. We're talking precision work here, akin to crafting a Stradivarius. The process is a symphony of heating, hammering, and tempering, and if you get it wrong, well, you've just made the world's most awkward butter knife. But it's not all about the glory of the battlefield. A blacksmith like you is just as likely to be found making plowshares as swords. And here's where the economics come into play. A well-crafted plowshare might set you back a couple of shillings, which, in today's terms, is like buying a high-end garden tool. But let's not forget, this is the Middle Ages, so a plowshare is less for a weekend hobbyist and more for ensuring your village doesn't starve. It's serious business. Now, about those domestic items. You're not just forging weapons of war. You're also the genius behind everyday essentials. Think cauldrons, nails, hinges, and those all-important horseshoes. A single horseshoe could cost around 2 pence, which might not sound like much, but when you're living in a world where a loaf of bread costs a penny, it's not exactly pocket change. These mundane items are the unsung heroes of your trade, the things that keep homes standing and shoes on horses. You're basically the medieval version of Home Depot, but with more soot and fewer fluorescent lights. Here's where we bust a big owl myth, the image of the lone blacksmith, toiling away in solitude. Charming, sure, but about as accurate as a medieval map. The truth is, blacksmithing was a collaborative trade, a network of craftsmen that would make LinkedIn jealous. In towns and cities, you'd often find entire families working side by side, each member mastering a different aspect of the craft. It's not just about one person and one hammer. It's about a team effort, a medieval co-op where the stakes are high and the work is hard. You'd also trade work with other craftsmen. Need some leather for those sword grips? You're swapping services with the local tanner. Need a new bellows? Better be on good terms with the local carpenter. This network of artisans was the lifeblood of medieval towns, a buzzing ecosystem of trade and skills that kept everything running smoother than a freshly oiled hinge. The blacksmith's role in warfare is legendary, but let's not forget the peacekeeping side of things. Tools like sickles, scythes, and spades were just as critical as swords and shields. After all, you can't eat valor, and you definitely can't plant a field with a longsword. Your work was essential in both war and peace. A dual role that ensured your place in the community was as sturdy as the anvils you wielded. Primary sources from the era, like guild records and tax documents, paint a picture of blacksmiths as indispensable as they were industrious. One account from the city of York in the 14th century lists over 30 blacksmiths working in various capacities, from making weapons to crafting the everyday items that kept society ticking. This isn't just a trade, it's a cornerstone of medieval life, a fact that's as undeniable as the soot under your fingernails. So, while the romantic image of the solitary blacksmith has its appeal, the reality is much richer and a whole lot busier. You're part of a vibrant community, a network of artisans and traders, each one contributing to the greater good. It's a world where every hammer stroke echoes with the weight of history, shaping not just metal, but the very fabric of society. And as you hang up your apron at the end of another long day, know this: you're not just crafting tools and weapons, you're crafting the future, one red-hot piece of iron at a time. So, as you hang up your apron at the end of another long day, know this: you're not just crafting tools and weapons, you're crafting the future, one red-hot piece of iron at a time. But while you're busy being the medieval Mac jiver, there's a whole feudal system breathing down your neck, and it's time to talk about that. Spoiler alert, it's not all jousts and jesters. Let's dive into the delightful labyrinth that is the feudal system. Picture it as a medieval pyramid scheme, but instead of hawking skincare, you've got vassals and serfs trading land for loyalty. At the top of this social cake is the local lord, and you, dear blacksmith, are somewhere in the middle, important but not exactly calling the shots. Your relationship with the lord is a mix of obligation and opportunity, like being the favorite nephew of a rich uncle. It's all well and good until taxes come into play. Ah, taxes. Even in the Middle Ages, the only two certainties in life were death and taxes. As a blacksmith, you were often required to pay taxes to the lord, usually in the form of goods or services. So, while you might not have been handing over hard cash, you'd be expected to provide a certain number of horseshoes or plowshares. It's like a barter system, but with more passive-aggressive notes left on your anvil. The upside: if you were indispensable enough, you could score some sweet perks. In certain cases, blacksmiths were exempt from some taxes altogether, given the essential nature of their work. It's the medieval equivalent of a corporate tax break, minus the accountants and PowerPoint presentations. But let's not pretend it was all rosy. The local lord could be as unpredictable as a medieval weather forecast, and maintaining his favor was a delicate dance. Now, let's talk about conflict, because nothing says medieval like a good war. Blacksmiths were the unsung heroes of the battlefield, the ghostwriters behind every glorious charge and valiant stand. You were the one crafting the swords and armor that knights would use to make a name for themselves, or lose it, depending on the battle. In times of war, your forge was a hive of activity, churning out weapons faster than a medieval bard could spin a tale. But here's a twist: blacksmiths weren't just armory artisans. In some cases, you might have been called upon to serve in the militia, swapping your hammer for a sword. It was all hands on deck, and your skills in metalwork made you a valuable asset. You weren't just making history, you were living it, sometimes on the front lines. Peace. On the other hand, presented its own set of challenges and opportunities. With fewer swords needed, you'd shift focus to agricultural tools and domestic items, keeping the local economy ticking over. It was about balancing the scales, ensuring that you remained relevant no matter what the political climate. After all, the only constant in the Middle Ages was change, and blacksmiths were the ultimate adapters. Ever heard of a blacksmith becoming famous? It's a rarity, sure, but not a myth. Take the legendary swordsmiths like Ulfbert, whose blades were so exceptional they've been found as far afield as Russia, dating back to the 9th and 10th centuries. These swords were the Rolls-Royce of the medieval world, renowned for their strength and craftsmanship. Owning one was a status symbol, a testament to wealth and power. Ulfbert may not have been a household name, but his work spoke volumes, and still does, clanging through the corridors of time. Then there's the political side of things. In some cases, blacksmiths would become advisors or confidants to the local lord, given their central role in the community. You might even find yourself embroiled in local politics, where forging alliances was just as crucial as forging metal. It was a precarious position, but one that came with its own set of rewards and risks. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The romantic notion that blacksmiths were always anonymous figures, toiling in obscurity sells short the reality. Sure, not every smith was a rock star, but many were well known within their communities. You were the person everyone relied on, and your reputation could make or break your business. Word of mouth was powerful, and a good blacksmith was worth their weight in iron. In summary, being a blacksmith was a balancing act, a tightrope walk between necessity and notoriety. You weren't just hammering metal. You were navigating a complex social and economic landscape, one that required as much political savvy as it did physical strength. As you reflect on your day, your hands calloused and weary, remember this. You're not just a craftsman. You're a key player in the grand chess game of medieval life, and every move you make echoes through the ages. Stay tuned, because the world of the blacksmith is about to get even more intriguing. So, with your hammer ready to strike another day's anvil, let's jump into the time machine and see how the legacy of blacksmiths has clanged its way into modern times. It turns out, the echoes of your medieval forge are louder than a knight's banquet after-party. First off, let's talk techniques. Medieval blacksmithing wasn't just muscle and mayhem. It was an art form. The precision and skill honed at the forge evolved into practices still used in modern metalworking. That rhythmic hammer dance you perfected, it's not just for show. The very principles of heating, hammering, and quenching metal laid the groundwork for contemporary metal industries. These methods, while refined and mechanized today, remain fundamentally unchanged. The blast furnace, a late medieval innovation, was the forerunner to the industrial-scale furnaces that powered the Industrial Revolution. Imagine the satisfaction a medieval blacksmith might feel knowing their methods led to the steam engine, and eventually the smartphone. Talk about an upgrade from plowshares. But it wasn't just about technique. The tools from your dusty medieval workshop have undergone a Cinderella transformation of their own. Anvils have become more specialized, hammers diversified into a range of types for specific tasks, and tongs and chisels have modernized with ergonomics in mind. While you might have been content with a basic set of tools, today's smiths have the luxury of a tool for every occasion. Yet the essence remains the same: heat, shape, cool, repeat. It's a formula as timeless as a knight's quest for glory. Now, let's address the myths. The blacksmith wielding flaming swords and casting spells in the public imagination is a delightful fiction, akin to thinking today's software engineers double as cyber warriors. Sure, blacksmiths were craftsmen of remarkable skill and occasionally dabbled in alchemy-esque experimentation, but they were no Gandalf. The romantic notion of a solitary figure hammering in the moonlight has been popularized by books, films, and TV shows, from Tolkien's Middle-earth to video games like Skyrim. But this lone wolf image overlooks the collaborative, bustling atmosphere of a real medieval forge. In reality, the blacksmith was more of a community anchor than a mystical hermit. Speaking of cultural impact, let's not ignore how blacksmiths have shaped technology and culture. The swords, plows, and tools crafted by medieval blacksmiths were the foundation of civilization's progress. Each piece of metalwork was a step forward in human capability, driving agricultural productivity and military prowess. Fast forward, and you see their legacy in the bridges we build, the cars we drive, the skyscrapers we erect. Without the blacksmith's contribution, the world would be a quieter place, or at least one with a lot less clang. The allure of blacksmithing has also found its way into modern media, shaping our perceptions of this iconic role. Movies and television often paint blacksmiths as rugged, solitary figures, but they were actually the original community influencers, minus the Instagram filters. This portrayal, while dramatized, taps into our longing for authenticity and craftsmanship in an age of mass production. It's no wonder that blacksmithing's been romanticized in media, from the quiet dignity of the blacksmith in Game of Thrones to the stoic, skilled artisan in Forged in Fire. A show that's basically a medieval bake-off, but with swords instead of soufflés. So, what can we learn from the past? At its core, blacksmithing teaches us the value of craftsmanship and the impact of skilled labor on society. In an era where the digital often overshadows the tangible, the blacksmith's legacy reminds us of the importance of creating with our hands. It's a call back to a time when skill and sweat were as valuable as gold. As we continue to innovate and evolve, the lessons from the forge, patience, precision, and perseverance remain relevant. It's about embracing the grind, quite literally, and understanding the weight of what we create. To wrap it all up, the legacy of the medieval blacksmith is a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. From the fiery workshops of the Middle Ages to the bustling factories of today, the blacksmith's influence is undeniable. Their tools and techniques laid the groundwork for technological progress, and their role in communities forged the social and economic structures that shaped our world. In every skyscraper, every vehicle, and every piece of modern machinery, there's a whisper of the anvil's ring, a nod to the blacksmiths who hammered out the future one strike at a time. So next time you marvel at a piece of modern engineering, remember, it all began with a blacksmith and a forge. And that, my friend, is a legacy as enduring as iron itself. Aristotle was born in Stagira, a quaint little city in northern Greece, around 384 BC. Stagira was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant that Aristotle's relentless curiosity probably made him the town's prodigal oddball. From the get-go, Aristotle wasn't your average ancient Greek kid. While others might have been content with a rousing game of knuckly-bones, young Aristotle was pondering the mysteries of the universe. His father, Nicomachus, was the court physician to the Macedonian king, which was about as prestigious a gig as a doctor could score back then. This meant Aristotle had access to all sorts of medical and scientific knowledge, and you could say it was his first taste of the intellectual buffet that was to become his life. But as the fates would have it, Aristotle's parents passed away when he was still a teenager, leaving him in the care of a guardian. He was eventually sent off to Athens, the bustling heart of ancient wisdom, to study at Plato's academy. Now, if you were into philosophy, this was like getting a VIP pass to the world's most exclusive think tank. Plato's academy was where the intellectual heavyweights of the time gathered to chew over the big questions of life, the universe, and everything. And guess what? Aristotle quickly became the star pupil, though not without causing a few eye rolls among his peers. Aristotle had a knack for asking questions that were as sharp as a Spartan sword. He'd listen to a lecture, and then hit Plato with a zinger that had everyone in the room scratching their heads. Imagine trying to impress your teacher with a profound observation, only to have Aristotle casually dismantle it with a single, well-placed question. That's the kind of guy he was. While most students took notes dutifully, Aristotle was notorious for his quirky habits. Legend has it that he was always pacing, a habit that earned him the nickname the peripatetic philosopher. This didn't just mean he liked to walk and talk, it was practically a teaching style. His fellow students probably had to jog alongside him just to keep up with his train of thought. You can imagine the scene, a gaggle of young philosophers, huffing and puffing in their tunics, struggling to jot down bits of wisdom as Aristotle rambled on about ethics and metaphysics. But let's not romanticize things too much. The academy wasn't all deep thoughts and olive oil. It was more like the academic version of a gladiator arena, minus the lions. The philosophical debates were intense, the coffee breaks non-existent, and the toga was the only dress code. Aristotle's penchant for challenging the status quo made him both admired and slightly irritating. Some of his classmates probably wished he'd just take a day off from being brilliant so they could catch up. One of the more amusing anecdotes from his academy days involves Aristotle's approach to studying the natural world. While most students were content to read about plants, Aristotle will be found in the gardens, nose deep in shrubbery, trying to figure out what made each leaf unique. His classmates might have found it odd when they stumbled upon him, half hidden in a bush, muttering about botany. But hey, that's how you become the father of biology. Now, in this philosophical soap opera, Plato was the wise elder statesman, the Yoda to Aristotle's Luke Skywalker. Plato's theory of forms was the hot topic. Essentially, the idea that the physical world is just a shadow of a higher, truer reality. Aristotle, with his love for empirical observation, wasn't entirely sold. He was more of a show me the evidence kind of guy. This skepticism led to some epic debates that probably had the other students grabbing popcorn or whatever the ancient Greek equivalent was. Despite their differences, Plato recognized Aristotle's brilliance and affectionately referred to him as the mind of the school. But Aristotle's habit of questioning everything might have occasionally tested Plato's patience. Picture it, a classroom full of eager students, Plato delivering a profound insight, and Aristotle raising his hand to say, "Yes, but..." It's no wonder that the philosophical air sometimes got a bit tense. In the end, Aristotle spent about 20 years at the academy. A significant chunk of his life, to be sure, but it was there that he honed his skills in logic, ethics, and metaphysics. He emerged not just as a philosopher, but as a critical thinker who'd go on to leave his mark across a staggering range of disciplines. From dissecting the structure of a syllogism to pondering the nature of happiness, Aristotle was a force to be reckoned with. So, what did all this mean for the philosophical environment of the time? Well, it was a period of intense intellectual exploration. Athens was the Silicon Valley of philosophy, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. The city was buzzing with debates on democracy, ethics, and the nature of reality. Being at the academy meant rubbing shoulders with the brightest minds, but it also meant you had to hold your own in the intellectual boxing ring. Aristotle's sharp wit and insatiable curiosity were like a breath of fresh air in these hallowed halls. He challenged the old guard while inspiring the next generation of philosophers. At the time he left the academy, he was ready to take on the world, or at least the bits of it that lay beyond the olive groves of Athens. After a solid 2-decade stint at Plato's academy, Aristotle was ready to swap the intellectual sparring of Athens for some fresh Mediterranean air. So, what did he do? He jetted off to the Macedonian court. Well, as much as one could jet off, in the 4th century BC. Think more along the lines of a dusty chariot ride. This wasn't just any royal gig, though. He was off to become the tutor of a certain ambitious Macedonian prince, Alexander, later to be dubbed the Great. Now, when we think of Alexander the Great, we imagine a military genius, the guy who practically had a PhD in conquering. But let's hit pause on that glorious mental picture. Aristotle's job was less about sculpting a future military colossus, and more about turning young Alex into a well-rounded Greek gentleman. Think of it as the classical world's version of a liberal arts education, minus the overpriced textbooks and dorm life. In 343 BC, Aristotle arrived in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, where he found a teenage Alexander who was less concerned with Plato's theory of forms and more interested in, say, the optimal angle for catapult projectiles. Aristotle's curriculum was a mix of philosophy, science, and the sort of Greek culture that would make sure Alexander didn't, turn into a complete barbarian while slashing his way across continents. Now, the romantic narrative paints Aristotle as the sage who instilled wisdom and virtue into Alexander's very being. But let's peel back the gilded veneer. Aristotle was more likely competing with Alexander's burgeoning fascination with the art of war, and believe it or not, his love for collecting rocks and bugs. That's right, our fierce conqueror had a soft spot for nature's critters. Aristotle, the father of biology, probably had more success teaching Alexander about beetles than about the ethical implications of subduing Persia. Picture Aristotle, deep in philosophical thought, trying to impart the nuances of ethics, only to be interrupted by a young prince who's more interested in the latest entomological specimen. Oh, the agony. It's as if Aristotle was trying to impart the wisdom of the ages to a kid whose heart was set on starting the ancient equivalent of Parkame and Go. Despite these distractions, Aristotle did manage to leave a mark on young Alexander. The prince's admiration for Greek culture and his subsequent efforts to spread it across his empire can be traced back to Aristotle's lessons. Yet, let's not kid ourselves. Alexander's military genius was less about philosophical enlightenment and more about raw ambition, with a touch of battlefield brilliance. Aristotle might have given him a moral compass, but Alexander was the one who decided to point it towards world domination. You might be wondering what their student-teacher interactions were like. Imagine Aristotle trying to explain the virtues of moderation, while Alexander, sword in hand, was daydreaming about his next conquest. The stories of their philosophical debates are the stuff of legend, but in reality, it was probably more of a push and pull between scholarly pursuits and the allure of military glory. Aristotle, ever the patient philosopher, likely had his moments of exasperation, muttering under his breath about the follies of youth. Economically speaking, tutoring the future ruler of a vast empire wasn't a bad gig. Aristotle's services didn't come cheap, but when you're shaping the mind of a prince with access to the treasures of Macedonia, you can afford to charge a premium. It's like getting hired to tutor the heir of a tech giant today, minus the stock options, but with plenty of political perks. As for their dynamic, it's worth noting that Aristotle wasn't just a hired brainiac. He was also a family friend, with connections to the Macedonian court through his father's work. This gave him a certain clout, allowing him to influence not only Alexander, but also the intellectual atmosphere of the entire court. But let's not pretend he was on a first-name basis with everyone. His influence was significant, yet clearly defined by the boundaries of his role as a tutor. Fast forward a few years, and Alexander was off on his military campaigns, leaving Aristotle back in Greece. While Alexander was busy building an empire, Aristotle was establishing his own school, the Lyceum, in Athens. Yet the myth of the great teacher stayed strong. It's a romantic notion, isn't it? The wise philosopher shaping the destiny of a world conqueror. But reality, as always, is a bit more mundane. Aristotle's teachings influenced Alexander, sure, but they didn't script his meteoric rise to power. So why does this myth persist? Well, it's just more fun to imagine Aristotle as some kind of wizard behind the curtain, secretly orchestrating history's great drama. But the truth is, Alexander's success was a cocktail of charisma, strategic acumen, and a dash of ruthlessness, ingredients that Aristotle probably had little to do with. It's like crediting your high school history teacher with your success in becoming a CEO. Sure, they taught you a thing or two, but you're the one who had to navigate the corporate jungle. As we wrap up this bit of ancient gossip, it's clear that Aristotle's time with Alexander was just one chapter in both their lives. The philosopher might have preferred a quieter existence, pondering the mysteries of nature, but fate had other plans. For Alexander, the lessons learned under Aristotle's tutelage were just stepping stones on the path to creating one of history's largest empires. Meanwhile, Aristotle continued to ponder, teach, and occasionally groan about the state of the world, proof that some things never change. In the next chapters of this historical saga, Aristotle's story continues as he returns to Athens, establishing his own legacy, while the echoes of his time with Alexander still reverberate through history. Stay tuned for more tales of ancient wisdom, intellectual rivalries, the enduring quest for knowledge in a world that was anything but static. Aristotle's return to Athens in 335 BC was less of a triumphant homecoming and more of a well-timed shuffle back to the intellectual heart of Greece. He arrived in a city still basking in the glow of its glory days, although by now the sheen was more nostalgia than anything else. Athens had its share of political turbulence. Imagine a city where every street corner was a soapbox. You've got the idea. But amidst the chatter and chaos, Aristotle had one thing on his mind, kicking off his own school, the Lyceum. Now, setting up a school in ancient Athens wasn't as simple as renting a building and hanging out a shingle. Think of it more like starting an educational startup, complete with the need for a strategic location, a solid curriculum, and of course, funding. Forget about crowdfunding or angel investors. Back then, the currency was clout, connections, and the occasional bag of coins. Aristotle, no stranger to navigating the choppy waters of Greek society, was more than equipped for the task. The Lyceum wasn't just any school. It was Aristotle's brainchild, a place where he could blend his love for empirical research with philosophical debates. Picture it as a mashup between a TED talk circuit and a biology lab, where students could ponder the metaphysical 1 minute and dissect a fish the next. It was revolutionary in its scope. Aristotle brought a practical, hands-on approach to learning that was a far cry from the more abstract teachings of his former haunt, Plato's Academy. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the whole endeavor. The Lyceum had its fair share of economic hurdles. For one, maintaining a steady stream of income was crucial. Aristotle wasn't exactly swimming in drachmas, so he had to be resourceful. Ancient Greece didn't have a tuition model like modern universities, so Aristotle relied on wealthy patrons and the support of the Athenian elite, who were eager to sponsor a philosopher with a reputation as sterling as his. Running the Lyceum wasn't just about keeping the lights on, metaphorically speaking, since the only light came from the sun and the occasional olive oil lamp. Aristotle needed to hire staff, maintain the grounds, and acquire materials for both teaching and research. We're talking about scrolls, writing tablets, and yes, the odd animal for dissection. It was an operation that demanded both a sharp mind and a sharp eye for budget management. One can imagine Aristotle, surrounded by a hodgepodge of scholars, scribes, and the occasional curious onlooker, trying to balance the books while simultaneously engaging in a heated debate about the nature of virtue. It's a comedic scenario. Aristotle, the great thinker, juggling philosophical insights with the mundane task of tallying expenses. How much did we spend on ink this month? Might have been a question he muttered more than once, his eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Despite the financial gymnastics, the Lyceum thrived. Aristotle's charisma and intellectual reputation attracted students from far and wide, eager to learn from the man who had tutored the mighty Alexander. The school offered a smorgasbord of subjects, from logic and ethics to politics and rhetoric. Aristotle's approach was both pragmatic and visionary, focusing on the real world rather than Plato's elusive ideals. In a city where the abstract was often king, this was a breath of fresh air. The Lyceum's grounds became a hub of activity. Picture Aristotle and his students wandering the colonnaded walkways, deep in discussion, their conversations punctuated by the chirping of cicadas and the occasional splash from a nearby fountain. It was a place where ideas flowed as freely as the wine at a symposium, and where the pursuit of knowledge was both a passion and a profession. Economically, Aristotle's model was ingenious. By leveraging his connections and reputation, he managed to secure enough support to keep the Lyceum afloat. It was a delicate balance, ensuring that the school remained accessible to those eager to learn, while also catering to the wealthy patrons who kept the coffers from running dry. It's a scenario that feels oddly familiar, even today, where education often balances on the fine line between idealism and finance. As for the comedic elements of running the Lyceum, there were plenty. Imagine Aristotle attempting to lead a discussion on ethics, only to be interrupted by a student more interested in the anatomy of a goat, or perhaps a spirited debate about metaphysics escalating into a full-blown argument over lunch, lamb versus lentils. The Lyceum was as much a place of learning as it was a microcosm of human nature, complete with all its quirks and idiosyncrasies. While the romantic narrative might paint the Lyceum as a place of serene contemplation and groundbreaking discoveries, the reality was often more chaotic. Aristotle had to navigate a maze of personalities, egos, and the occasional philosophical crisis. But in the midst of it all, he never lost sight of his mission, to explore the world through reason and observation, and to instill that same spirit of inquiry in his students. And so, Aristotle's Lyceum became a pillar of Athenian intellectual life, a testament to his vision and determination. It was a place where the past met the future, where ancient wisdom was questioned and refined, and where the seeds of modern science and philosophy were sown. As Aristotle paced the corridors, perhaps he mused on the irony of it all, how a boy from Stagira had come to shape the minds of Athens, and by extension, the world. But even the greatest philosophers couldn't predict everything. The Lyceum might have been his legacy, but as history would show, it was only the beginning. The story of Aristotle was far from over, and the echoes of his teachings would resonate long after the cicadas had gone silent. Aristotle's Lyceum wasn't just a spot for waxing philosophical. It was a veritable intellectual beehive, buzzing with ideas that would echo down the corridors of history. If you've ever heard someone toss around terms like ethics or metaphysics at a dinner party and felt that pang of confusion, you've got Aristotle to thank, or curse, depending on how much you enjoy philosophical banter. But before you dismiss these concepts as ancient gobbledygook, let's take a closer look at what Aristotle was really up to. First off, let's tackle Aristotle's obsession with categorization. Yes, he was the original type of personality, meticulously organizing everything from politics to plants. He loved a good list more than a modern-day productivity guru. Seriously, if Aristotle were alive today, he'd probably have a color-coded spreadsheet for everything. But this wasn't just a quirk, it was revolutionary. In a world where chaos often reigned supreme, Aristotle's methodical approach was like a breath of fresh air, or at the very least, a well-organized filing cabinet. Take his work in biology, for instance. Aristotle wasn't content with simply observing nature. He wanted to classify it. He divided animals into those with blood and those without, a system that might make modern biologists cringe, but was groundbreaking for its time. His Historia Animalium was essentially the world's first zoological encyclopedia, a testament to his relentless curiosity and penchant for order. It might not have been flawless. Okay, it wasn't flawless, but it laid the groundwork for centuries of scientific inquiry. Now, about those contentious relationships with other philosophers. Aristotle wasn't exactly the most popular guy in the philosophical playground. Sure, he had clout, but he also had a knack for rubbing people the wrong way with his incessant questioning and critical eye. Take his relationship with Plato. While there was undoubtedly mutual respect, Aristotle's tendency to poke holes in Plato's theories probably made their intellectual sparring sessions more like philosophical cage matches. Plato's theory of forms, for example, posited that the physical world was just a shadow of a higher reality. Aristotle, ever the empiricist, wasn't buying it. He argued for a more tangible approach, focusing on the here and now rather than some ethereal plane of existence. This didn't exactly win him any popularity contests with the Platonic crowd, but it did set him apart as a thinker who valued evidence over abstraction. Aristotle's ethical theories were another kettle of fish. While Plato was busy contemplating the ideal state, Aristotle was getting down to brass tacks, exploring what made a good life in practical terms. His Nicomachean ethics sought to define virtue as a balance between extremes, a kind of philosophical Goldilocks zone. Courage, for instance, was a balance between recklessness and cowardice. It's a theory that's still applicable today, whether you're navigating office politics or figuring out how much coffee is too much coffee. But here's where things get ironic. Despite Aristotle's genius, some of his theories now seem quaint, a bit like those ancient maps that showed dragons at the edge of the world. Take his views on the cosmos. Aristotle was convinced of a geocentric universe where everything revolved around the Earth. It was a comforting notion, one that put humanity at the center of everything, until Copernicus came along, that is, and ruined the party by suggesting otherwise. Yet, even as we chuckle at these outdated ideas, it's crucial to remember that Aristotle was a pioneer. His willingness to question and categorize laid the foundation for modern science and philosophy. The fact that some of his theories were off the mark doesn't diminish his impact. It highlights the evolutionary nature of knowledge itself. In terms of influence, Aristotle was a heavyweight champ, casting a long shadow over both ancient and modern thought. His works were rediscovered during the Middle Ages, profoundly shaping European intellectual life. The scholastics, for instance, were like a fan club, poring over his texts and integrating them into Christian doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, the ultimate Aristotle fanboy, referred to him simply as the philosopher. Talk about a legacy. Of course, Aristotle's ideas weren't limited to the dusty corners of medieval libraries. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and you'll find his fingerprints all over the place, from art to politics. His emphasis on empirical observation and logic was a catalyst for the scientific revolution, challenging people to look beyond superstition and dogma. Galileo and Newton, those titans of science, stood on the shoulders of Aristotle, even as they toppled some of his cherished beliefs. But let's not get too misty-eyed. The reality is that while Aristotle's influence was profound, he wasn't infallible. Some of his ideas, like his musings on natural slavery, are rightly criticized today. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds are products of their time, shaped by the social and political structures around them. Aristotle lived in a world where slavery was an accepted norm, and his writings reflect that. It doesn't excuse his views, but it adds context to the complex tapestry of his philosophy. In the end, Aristotle was a man who embraced the chaos of the world around him and tried to make sense of it. His legacy is one of relentless inquiry, a testament to the power of asking questions, even when the answers aren't what you expect. So, the next time you find yourself wrestling with a philosophical conundrum or just trying to organize your sock drawer, take a moment to appreciate the original type of personality who started it all. But don't go anywhere just yet. Our journey through Aristotle's world is far from over. There's more to explore in the realm of ancient wisdom, intellectual rivalries, and the endless quest for knowledge. As we delve deeper into the life and times of this extraordinary thinker, we'll uncover more tales of brilliance and folly, of ambition and humility, a saga that continues to captivate and confound us even after all these centuries. Aristotle's later years were anything but the serene twilight of a wise old sage gently fading into the annals of history. Instead, picture a man who, even in his final chapter, was as restless as ever, a philosophical dynamo chasing knowledge like a caffeinated squirrel after a particularly elusive acorn. By the time Aristotle was in his 60s, he had amassed a portfolio of work that would make any modern academic's head spin. We're talking about over 200 treatises covering everything from metaphysics to marine biology, though only around 30 survive today. That's right, the guy was practically a one-man Wikipedia long before the digital age made information as accessible as cat videos. But let's not get too romantic about it. Aristotle's relentless pursuit of wisdom might have left him with a legendary reputation, but it also came with its fair share of personal sacrifices. For one, his devotion to intellectual exploration didn't exactly make him a social butterfly. His personal life was a bit like a philosophical text, dense, complicated, and often hard to decipher. Aristotle was married to Pythias, who was both his wife and the niece of a tyrant, which sounds like the plot of an ancient Greek soap opera. She bore him a daughter, also named Pythias, and after her death, Aristotle reportedly had a long-term relationship with Hercules, with whom he had a son, Nicomachus. Yet, the details of his family life remain murky, shrouded in the fog of time, and overshadowed by his intellectual pursuits. It's safe to say that Aristotle wasn't winning any Dad of the Year awards, not when he was more likely to be found dissecting a fish than playing hopscotch with his kids. As for his death in 322 BC, it wasn't exactly the stuff of legend. Aristotle passed away in Chalcis, on the island of Euboea, reportedly from a stomach illness. Hardly the dramatic exit one might expect from such a towering figure. Yet, in a way, it's fitting. Here was a man who spent his life dissecting the mysteries of the universe, only to be undone by the humdrum reality of human frailty. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds are subject to the whims of biology, a humbling thought for anyone who's ever felt invincible. Now, let's tackle Aristotle's enduring legacy, because this is where things get really interesting. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'd find his works being pored over by scholars in the Islamic Golden Age, where thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes gave Aristotle a second wind, interpreting and expanding upon his ideas. By the 12th century, his teachings were reintroduced to Western Europe, setting the stage for what can only be described as an Aristotelian renaissance. Universities sprouted across the continent, with Aristotle's works forming the backbone of their curricula, and his logic became the scaffolding for scholastic theology. It was like a philosophical comeback tour, and Aristotle was the headliner. But here's the twist. While Aristotle was being lauded as the intellectual heavyweight of the medieval world, others were starting to poke holes in his theories. Enter the Renaissance, that grand era of rebirth and rediscovery, where thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo took one look at Aristotle's geocentric model and politely, well, maybe not so politely, suggested he got it all wrong. It was as if the universe itself was issuing a cosmic, actually, reminding everyone that science is nothing if not a series of revisions. Despite these challenges, Aristotle's influence was like that of a stubborn weed, hard to uproot and pervasive. His insistence on empirical observation laid the groundwork for the scientific method, a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the world today. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Aristotle's legacy is how it has been both revered and critiqued over the centuries. His ideas have been the foundation upon which countless others have built, and yet they have also been the scaffolding for new theories that have dismantled some of his most cherished beliefs. So, what to make of Aristotle, the man, the myth, the philosopher? Was he the wise old sage, imparting timeless wisdom from his ancient lectern? Or was he a relentless seeker, driven by an insatiable curiosity that left little room for anything else? The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Aristotle was a man of contradictions, a thinker who valued order yet thrived in chaos, a philosopher whose ideas both grounded and challenged the world. His legacy is a testament to the enduring power of curiosity and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. It's a reminder that wisdom, far from being a static endpoint, is a moving target, forever elusive, always evolving. As we wrap up this journey through Aristotle's life, it's worth reflecting on the nature of wisdom itself. Perhaps wisdom isn't about the answers we find, but the questions we continue to ask. In a world that often favors certainty over inquiry, maybe the real legacy of Aristotle is his willingness to embrace the unknown, to look at the world not as it is, but as it could be. And that, dear listeners, might just be the wisest lesson of all. If you ever thought rags to riches stories were a modern invention, let me introduce you to Liu Bang, the original underdog from 206 BCE who took social climbing to a whole new level, straight to the imperial throne. Now, Liu Bang wasn't your textbook emperor material. Unlike those with blue blood coursing through their veins, Liu Bang was born into a peasant family, the kind of folks who'd be more likely to be found tilling fields than ruling kingdoms. Yet, somehow, this Everyman managed to grip the reins of power and found the Han Dynasty, which would go on to leave a legacy so monumental that even Confucius would nod in approval. So how did a guy with peasant roots secure the ultimate career promotion? Well, hold on to your history books, because this is where things get interesting. Liu Bang, who started off as a low-level government official, found himself in the midst of the chaotic collapse of the Qin dynasty. The Qin, with their penchant for draconian laws and massive public works, had ticked off just about everyone, and their downfall opened the door for enterprising folks like Liu Bang. Let's set the stage. It's 206 BCE, and China is in the throes of a massive power vacuum. Enter Liu Bang, who, with the finesse of a reality show contestant, maneuvered through the chaos, rallying troops and winning battles against rivals who seemed more like caricatures of villainy than real threats. By the end of it, he managed to outwit the infamous Xiang Yu, a warrior known for his brute strength and questionable long-term strategy skills. Imagine a chess match where one player is flipping the board every 5 minutes. That was Xiang Yu. Meanwhile, Liu Bang played the long game, securing alliances and slowly growing his power base. But it wasn't all glittering victories and heroic triumphs. Liu Bang's rise was peppered with the kind of drama that would make even the most seasoned soap opera writers blush. Take Empress Liu, for example. She was Liu Bang's wife and a force to be reckoned with in her own right. Her reputation for being Machiavellian in her political dealings is legendary, and for good reason. After Liu Bang's death, she played the regency game like a grandmaster, taking power into her own hands while making sure her family got more than just the leftovers. Think of her as the Cersei Lannister of ancient China, minus the dragons, but with plenty of palace intrigue. Now, Liu Bang wasn't just about sword-swinging and strategic marriages. He had a vision for stabilizing and rejuvenating China's battered economy. The Qin dynasty had left a bit of a mess, all right, a massive mess, by overtaxing the populace and forcing them into unpaid labor for those iconic but back-breaking projects like the Great Wall. Liu Bang knew that if he wanted to keep his subjects from revolting, he'd need to make some serious economic reforms. So, he reduced taxes and lightened the burdens of labor, which was kind of like promising everyone a day off plus a bonus. He also encouraged agriculture, realizing that a well-fed populace was less likely to pick up pitchforks and start a rebellion. And then there's the myth-busting. Let's get one thing straight. Liu Bang wasn't some saintly figure descended from the heavens with a halo of benevolence. He was pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, and certainly opportunistic. His economic reforms weren't purely altruistic. They were calculated moves to ensure his dynasty's longevity. By setting up a system that balanced legalist and Confucian principles, he played both ends against the middle, making sure that the bureaucratic machinery of the Han Dynasty ran smoothly without alienating the scholars who were fond of quoting Confucius at dinner parties. So why does any of this matter? Well, the Han Dynasty set the template for what it meant to be Chinese, influencing everything from language to culture, and even the political systems for centuries to come. Without Liu Bang's cunning and his knack for economic strategy, the Han might have been just another footnote in history, a forgotten chapter rather than the epic saga it became. In the end, Liu Bang's story is a reminder that history is full of surprises, and sometimes the unlikeliest of characters end up shaping the world in ways we still feel today. It's about time we give this peasant-turned emperor his due, not just as a historical figure, but as a testament to the power of resilience, cunning, and a bit of good old-fashioned luck. Yet, the story was only just beginning for the Han Dynasty. With the throne secured and the economy on the mend, the next logical step was, of course, to expand. Because what's an empire if not a sprawling collection of territories, right? Enter the Han Dynasty's bold expansionist policies and military exploits, a saga that makes Game of Thrones look like a neighborhood squabble. The Han were not content to just babysit their borders. No, these guys had ambition. They were eyeing everything from the steppes of Central Asia to the jungles of Southeast Asia, and they weren't shy about it. Around 130 BCE, the Han Dynasty decided to put its stamp on the world map by creating the Silk Road, a trade route so long it made the Great Wall look like a garden fence. Stretching over 4,000 miles from China to the Mediterranean, the Silk Road was less of a road and more of a chaotic patchwork of paths and trails. It was the ancient world's answer to Amazon Prime, except with fewer delivery guarantees and a lot more bandits. This wasn't just a stroll in the park. It was a massive economic artery that pumped goods, culture, and sometimes chaos across continents. Let's put this into perspective. The Silk Road wasn't just about peddling silk, though that was certainly a highlight. It was a veritable marketplace for everything from spices to ideas. Chinese silk was all the rage in Rome, and Roman glassware found its way to the east. It was like the ancient version of eBay, minus the user reviews. But before you start picturing a harmonious exchange of goods and pleasantries, you should know that the Silk Road was about as peaceful as a rock concert marsh pit. Bandits, weather, and political instability were constant companions for traders, a little like trying to drive cross-country with a flat tire and a broken GPS. Despite the risks, the economic impact of the Silk Road was enormous. It transformed the Han Dynasty into a commercial juggernaut, enriching it with taxes and tribute from trading partners. The Silk Road turned the Han into a global player, one that could flex its muscles both economically and culturally. But every rose has its thorn, and the Silk Road was no exception. Not everyone was thrilled about this new trade network. Local rulers who'd been bypassed by the route were left grumbling in its dusty wake, while others found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the Han's imperial ambitions. And then there were the diplomatic marriages. If you think your family gatherings are awkward, try arranging a wedding between two rival kingdoms. The Han emperors were masters of the strategic marriage, using the tactic as a way to cement alliances or neutralize hostile neighbors. It was like playing chess, but with wedding rings instead of pawns. These marriages could be as absurd as they were strategic, with brides sent off to marry foreign rulers who were sometimes more interested in power than in love. Talk about a tough crowd at the wedding reception. But let's not romanticize these diplomatic unions too much. They weren't exactly fairy tales. Many of these brides were young women shipped off like parcels, their futures tied to the whims of political strategy rather than personal choice. It was a world where love took a backseat to alliances, and where a marriage certificate could be more powerful than a peace treaty. So, what's the takeaway here? The Han Dynasty's expansion wasn't just about planting flags and building roads. It was a complex web of economic strategy, military might, and diplomatic maneuvering. The Silk Road and those strategic marriages were both tools and symbols of the Han's imperial ambitions, helping to shape a world where China was not just a country, but a force to be reckoned with. And while it's tempting to get lost in the romance of silk and spices, the reality was far grittier. Behind the veils of trade and diplomacy lay a world where power was the ultimate currency, and where the stakes were as high as the Himalayas. In the end, the Han's expansionist policies set the stage for a new era in Chinese history, one that would see the empire stretch its influence far beyond its borders. It was a testament to the power of vision, determination, and a little bit of opportunism, the kind of story that reminds us why history is far more thrilling than fiction. But don't just take my word for it. Stay tuned as we unravel more of the Han Dynasty's grand tapestry, filled with twists, turns, and plenty of historical intrigue. While the Han Dynasty was busy turning maps into wish lists and sprinkling its influence like confetti across continents, back home, the empire was cooking up a cultural and technological feast that would set the table for centuries. Now, if you think the Romans had a monopoly on innovation, think again, because the Han were about to drop a mic, or rather, a scroll, on the world stage with the invention of paper in 105 CE. Forget stone tablets and bamboo slips. Paper was the ancient world's equivalent of going digital, and it changed the game in a way that even Gutenberg would have to tip his hat to. The brain behind this papery revolution, Kai Lan, Han court official, whose legacy was sealed when he whipped up the first batch of paper using a blend of mulberry bark, hemp, old rags, and fishnets. Talk about recycling before it was cool. This wasn't just a crafty DIY project. It was a technological leap that made writing more accessible, transforming how information was recorded, stored, and shared. Imagine going from chiseling your grocery list into stone to jotting it down on a handy sheet of paper. It was a game changer, folks. Suddenly, the written word was more portable, and the bureaucracy of the Han Empire could expand like an overzealous empire builder's waistline after a feast. Speaking of bureaucracy, let's dive into the rise of Confucianism as the state doctrine, a move that would have made Confucius himself do a little victory dance. The Han Dynasty, perhaps realizing the chaos of their predecessors, wasn't a sustainable political strategy, decided to embrace Confucian ideals as the moral backbone of their administration. This wasn't just about quoting Confucius at dinner parties anymore. It was about embedding his teachings into the very fabric of governance. The Confucian classics became the cornerstone of education and civil service, shaping everything from court etiquette to the way officials were appointed, promoted, and sometimes demoted. But let's not get carried away with the romantic notion of noble scholars ascending the ranks purely on merit. The famed civil service exams, introduced during the Han period and perfected over the centuries, were supposed to be the great equalizer, a democratic way for talented individuals, regardless of their social standing, to serve the empire. In theory, it was meritocracy at its finest. In practice, though, well, let's just say it was a little more complicated than that. Imagine sitting in a tiny examination cell for days, trying to recall every Confucian text you've ever read, all while warding off hunger and fatigue. That was the reality for candidates who undertook the grueling imperial exams. It was less like an intellectual challenge and more like a medieval endurance test. And while the exams were theoretically open to anyone, the reality was that only those with the time and resources to study, often the sons of wealthy families, stood a real chance of passing. So much for egalitarian ideals, right? And then there was the political favoritism, because what's a good system without a little nepotism to spice things up? Despite the exam system's lofty goals, connections and influence often played a significant role in securing government positions. If you think networking is a modern invention, let me introduce you to the ancient Chinese court, where who you knew could sometimes matter more than what you knew. The idealized meritocracy of the civil service, exams often collided head-on with the harsh reality of political maneuvering and favoritism. Yet, this system, flawed as it was, laid the foundation for one of the most enduring bureaucratic structures in history. It was a grand experiment in governance that, despite its imperfections, helped to stabilize the empire and create a semblance of order amid the chaos. The civil service exams became a cornerstone of Chinese culture, embodying the values of education and hard work even as they underscored the gap between ideals and reality. In the end, the Han Dynasty's cultural and technological innovations were as much about the stories they told as the changes they wrought. The invention of paper was not just a technological advancement, it was a symbol of the hand's ingenuity and their ability to transform the mundane into the monumental. Confucianism's rise as a state doctrine wasn't just about philosophy. It was about creating a moral framework that could guide an empire. And the civil service exams, for all their flaws, represented the enduring belief in education as a path to success, a belief that continues to resonate across cultures and centuries. So, the next time you jot down a note on a piece of paper or feel the pressure of an exam, remember the Han Dynasty. They were the ones who turned paper into a medium of power, who sought to govern with wisdom drawn from ancient texts, and who, even in their imperfections, laid the groundwork for the complex dance of merit and influence that defines human history. And while their story doesn't end here, it certainly leaves us with plenty to ponder, and plenty more to explore in the next chapter of this epic saga. And speaking of tests that could make or break an empire, let's talk about the Han Dynasty's internal challenges, which were less about paper and philosophy, and more about the kind of chaos that makes you wonder if anyone was actually in charge. You see, while the Han were busy scripting their legacy with Confucian ideals and technological marvels, they were also writing a cautionary tale of how even the strongest empires can crumble from within. Enter the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE, a grassroots movement that was anything but a friendly neighborhood protest. This uprising was led by the charismatic Zhang Ju and his brothers, who, inspired by Taoist teachings, decided they'd had enough of the Han's nonsense. Now, Zhang Ju wasn't just some guy with a bone to pick. He was more like a charismatic cult leader with a following of, about 360,000 discontented peasants. Imagine Woodstock, but swap the peace signs for pitchforks, and you get the idea. The Yellow Turbans were fed up with heavy taxes, corrupt officials, and a government that seemed more interested in palace intrigue than in the plight of the common people. It was like the empire had become a bad reality show, with bureaucrats more concerned about their own ratings than the viewers. Citizens. The rebellion spread like wildfire, and the Han court found itself scrambling to put out flames with a bucket that had more holes than a Swiss cheese. The cost of quelling the rebellion was astronomical, both in terms of lives and resources. The Han military, already stretched thin by border defenses and previous campaigns, was forced to divert significant manpower and funds to crush the uprising. It was like trying to fight a house fire with a garden hose, and it left the empire's coffers emptier than a college student's fridge. But wait, there's more. As if the rebellion wasn't enough of a headache, the Han court was embroiled in its own Game of Thrones-style saga, starring everybody's favorite political power players, the eunuchs. These guys weren't just minor characters in the imperial drama. They were the puppet masters pulling the strings behind the throne. With their unique position of trust, or manipulation, depending on who you ask, eunuchs wielded enormous influence, often surpassing that of the emperor himself. Now, in a plot twist worthy of a soap opera, these eunuchs were often seen as both heroes and villains. On one hand, they were trusted confidants who could ensure the emperor's word was law. On the other, they were infamous for their corruption and penchant for backroom deals that would make any politician blush. It was like having your own PR team that occasionally embezzles your funds. By the end of the Eastern Han period, eunuchs had become so entrenched in politics that they were practically running the show. This brings us to the mandate of heaven, that celestial seal of approval which supposedly justified an emperor's rule. But here's the kicker. When natural disasters struck, they were seen as cosmic warnings that the emperor had lost the mandate. Imagine being blamed for an earthquake because your approval ratings tanked. Floods in the Yellow River Basin, plagues, and famines were all interpreted as divine sideswipes at the Han court's legitimacy. It's like the universe had its own Yelp review system, and it wasn't afraid to use it. The irony of all this celestial finger-wagging was that it only added fuel to the fire of rebellion and dissent. Peasants and local leaders could point to these disasters and say, "See, even the heavens think we need new management." And so the empire found itself caught in a vicious cycle of unrest, natural calamities, and political instability. As if that weren't enough, managing the empire's vast and growing territory came with a price tag that rivaled the GDP of small countries. The costs of maintaining a sprawling bureaucracy, a standing army, and the Silk Road's security were astronomical. It was like trying to keep a luxury yacht afloat with a set of leaky oars. The Han government had to rely on heavy taxation and forced labor, which, surprise, surprise, didn't exactly endear them to the populace. It was a classic case of robbing Peter to pay Paul, with both parties getting increasingly disgruntled. So, what's the takeaway from this chapter of Han history? Well, it's a stark reminder that empires, no matter how mighty, are only as strong as the foundations they're built on. The Han Dynasty, with its towering achievements and cultural legacies, was also a lesson in the pitfalls of power unchecked and the perils of internal discord. It's a story that echoes through the annals of history, reminding us that even the grandest tales of conquest and innovation can be undone by the human elements of greed, ambition, and occasionally cosmic disapproval. And yet, for all their flaws and follies, the Han left an indelible mark on history. Their story doesn't end here, but rather continues as a poignant reminder that the art of governance is as much about managing the mundane as it is about achieving the monumental. So, grab your popcorn and stay tuned, because the saga of the Han Dynasty is far from over, with more twists and turns than a Silk Road caravan. As the curtain drops on the Han Dynasty, it's a tale of grandeur and grit, where myth and reality tango in the annals of history. The final act opens circa 220 CE, with the empire's dissolution declaring an end to an era. So what finally did the Han in? Was it the rebellious peasants, the conniving eunuchs, or perhaps the cosmic Yelp reviews? The answer, like any good historical plot twist, is all of the above, with a sprinkle of imperial overreach for good measure. First, let's talk about the economy. The Han's ambitious expansions and lavish court life required a bankroll that made modern budgets look like piggy banks. Maintaining an empire stretching over 5 million square kilometers was no cheap affair. The Silk Road, while a fantastic global marketplace, was also a financial sinkhole requiring constant military oversight to keep those pesky bandits at bay. And the army wasn't just for show. It sucked in resources like a black hole, demanding more silver than a Roman shopping spree. Add to this the cost of quelling ongoing rebellions and natural disasters, and you're looking at an empire that's hemorrhaging money faster than it can collect taxes. The Han's solution: raise taxes, of course, but squeezing the populace like a stress ball only led to more unrest, creating a vicious cycle that would make a hamster wheel look like a leisurely stroll. On the political front, the court was a battlefield of its own. The eunuchs, those shadowy figures of influence, were embroiled in power struggles that left the empire's leadership about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. The last Han emperor, Emperor Zion, was more of a puppet than a ruler, with warlords from across the realm pulling his strings. Imagine trying to run a country while being treated like a chess piece. No wonder the empire was in tatters. Speaking of warlords, let's not forget the Three Kingdoms period that followed. It was like a historical season finale with multiple plot lines. Cao Wai, Shu Han, and Eastern Wu, each carving up the remnants of the Han like it was the world's most complicated pie chart. The Han Dynasty's fall wasn't just the end of a dynasty. It was the start of a new era of fragmentation and conflict that would shape China for centuries. Yet, despite its dramatic fall, the Han Dynasty's legacy is anything but a tragedy. For starters, the cultural and technological innovations set foundations that would outlast the empire's physical borders. Paper, that humble invention by Kai Lan, became the mainstay of record-keeping and administration, outliving the dynasty by a couple of millennia. The civil service exams, though flawed, would be refined and institutionalized by later dynasties, becoming a cornerstone of Chinese governance and a symbol of intellectual meritocracy. And then there's Confucianism. The Han's adoption of Confucian ideals as state doctrine wasn't just a passing fad. It became the philosophical bedrock for future dynasties. Confucianism's emphasis on hierarchy, duty, and moral governance resonated through the ages, influencing not just politics, but also social structures and personal relationships. It was as much a part of China's cultural DNA as chopsticks and tea ceremonies. But let's not romanticize the Han too much. The dynasty story is also one of harsh realities, of a society where the gap between rich and poor could swallow a chariot, where power was often wielded with more cunning than moral authority, and where the pursuit of imperial glory sometimes overshadowed the welfare of its people. The Hand's history is a reminder that great achievements often come with a price, and that the allure of power can just as easily lead to downfall as it can to triumph. Despite the dynasty's collapse, its influence set the stage for the unification and cultural identity of China. Future dynasties, including the Tang and the Ming, would look back at the Han as a model of governance, innovation, and culture. Even today, the Han dynasty is often seen as a golden age, a period of prosperity and progress, albeit with a few more bumps in the road than the history books might let on. So, as we wrap up this historical roller coaster, what's the takeaway? The Han dynasty, with all its peaks and pitfalls, is a testament to the complexities of empire building. It's a saga of resilience and ambition, where the human elements of greed, wisdom, and folly play out on a grand stage. It's about the enduring belief in the power of ideas and the relentless march of progress, even in the face of adversity. In the end, the Han dynasty is more than just a chapter in a textbook. It's a reminder of the delicate dance between myth and reality, and how history, like life, is rarely black and white. It's a story that leaves us both in awe of its achievements and reflective of its lessons, a narrative that continues to inspire and caution, echoing through the corridors of time with a whisper that's anything but forgotten. So, next time you find yourself pondering the past, remember the Han. Their tale is a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, woven into the very fabric of what it means to be human. In the sun-drenched lands of Nubia, the kingdom of Kush was the underdog that became the heavyweight champion, emerging from the shadows of Egypt around 1070 BCE. Imagine being a neighbor to Egypt at its peak, a civilization that practically invented grandeur. The Egyptians had pyramids, pharaohs, and gods with more drama than a soap opera. But while Egypt was busy with its elaborate tombs and divine soapboxes, Kush was quietly crafting its own identity, like a band going indie after opening for a global sensation. Kush, nestled around the Nile's southern stretch, was a place where you couldn't just hitch a ride on a pyramid scheme. This was a kingdom that had to carve out its own niche, quite literally, from the hard, unforgiving rock of the Nubian desert. The origins of Kush are tangled with Egypt's narrative, much like the sequel that's somehow better than the original. It's the story of a civilization that started as a footnote and ended up writing its own chapter in the history books. Now, let's talk about the early rulers of Kush, starting with the legendary King Alara. Alara, the man, the myth, the mystery. He's a bit like that enigmatic artist whose early works are hard to come by, leaving historians squinting at ancient records with the intensity of a detective sifting through cold case files. Alara is often credited with laying the groundwork for the Kushite dynasty, but concrete details about his reign are as elusive as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Alara's legacy, however, is no small feat. He was the first in a line of rulers who saw the potential of Kush beyond being just Egypt's southern annex. Under his leadership, Kush began to forge a cultural identity that was distinct and proud. Alara's reign is shrouded in the kind of mystery that would make for a great Netflix series, if only we had more than just whispers from ancient tombs and fragments of stone inscriptions. But what we do know is that the Kushites were not content to merely mimic their northern neighbors. They had their own gods, their own language, and yes, their own brand of pyramid building, which might have been smaller but were no less significant. The Kushite pyramids, sharp and steep, were a testament to their ingenuity and resourcefulness, kind of like the minimalists of the pyramid world. All the symbolism, none of the unnecessary grandeur. And let's not forget the economic hustle that was Kush. This was a kingdom that knew how to work with what it had. Gold, ivory, and ebony were the bling of the ancient world, and Kush had them in spades. The Nile was their ancient trade route, flowing with goods that made the kingdom a key player in regional commerce. Think of it as the Amazon of the ancient world, minus the 2-day shipping. Socially and politically, Kush was a melting pot of influences. While they borrowed a few tricks from the Egyptians, like the whole divine ruler thing, they put their own spin on it. The Kushite kings weren't just pharaoh copycats. They were innovators who adapted and thrived in a harsh environment. They managed to maintain an impressive degree of autonomy, even while under the cultural and political pressure of their northern neighbors. But let's not get too romantic here. The harsh reality of life in Kush was, well, harsh. The kingdom was often at the mercy of the Nile's unpredictable flooding, which could make or break a season's harvest. And while being a trade hub had its perks, it also meant that Kush was in the crosshairs of every power-hungry ruler in the vicinity. If Kush was a party, it was one that everyone wanted an invitation to, not always for the right reasons. Alara's successors would continue to build on his foundation, but it was Alara who set the stage for what Kush would become, a kingdom that dared to stand out in a world that expected them to blend in. By doing so, they ensured that the name Kush would echo through the corridors of history long after the last stone was laid on their pyramids. As we delve deeper into the rise of this intriguing kingdom, remember that Kush was more than just Egypt's shadow. It was the dawn of a narrative all its own. In the bustling world of ancient empires, Kush was about to pull off a plot twist that would make Game of Thrones look like a bedtime story. By the 8th century BCE, this once overshadowed kingdom was ready to turn the tables on its illustrious northern neighbor, Egypt. It was time for Kush to step out of the grand Egyptian shadow and into the spotlight with all the flair of a rock band finally headlining its own world tour. Enter Pi, the Kushite king with a name that sounds like a cool breeze, but a reign that was anything but mellow. Pi, or as his full title went, Pi the Conqueror, or perhaps Pi the Seriously Ambitious, was not content to merely preserve the status quo. No, he had bigger plans, and those plans involved a little jaunt north to take control of Egypt. This wasn't just a matter of expanding borders for the sake of empire. It was a savvy political move wrapped in the drama of ancient world power plays. You see, Egypt was in a bit of a mess at the time. Picture a board meeting where everyone's arguing and nobody knows who's in charge. The country was split into smaller factions, each with its own ruler, each claiming a piece of the pie. And Pi, with the kind of strategic acumen that would make modern CEOs green with envy, saw an opportunity. Kush's military strategy wasn't just about marching in and hoping for the best. The Kushite army was a force to be reckoned with, and Pi had an ace up his sleeve, the cavalry. In a time when most soldiers were still hoofing it on foot, Kush had mastered the art of the mounted warrior, bringing a fast-paced edge to the battlefield. The plan was as simple as it was audacious. Sweep through the factions like a well-oiled machine, one that was both terrifyingly efficient and economically shrewd. After all, war isn't cheap, and Pi knew the value of a good return on investment. But Pi's approach to conquest wasn't just about military might. He was a savvy diplomat, too. He understood the value of religious legitimacy in a world where divine favor was the ancient equivalent of a golden endorsement. So, Pi didn't just conquer, he made nice with the gods. He was a devout worshipper of Ammon, and he used this to his advantage, positioning himself as the rightful ruler blessed by the deities themselves. This was a guy who understood that in the ancient world, having the gods on your side was like having the ultimate influencer in your corner. In 728 BCE, Pi made his move, and it was a masterclass in empire building. He swept into Egypt with the precision of a seasoned chess player, capturing city after city, each conquest a checkmate in his audacious game. The city of Thebes, with its grand temples and wealth, was a particularly juicy target. Pi didn't just want Egypt, he wanted its heart, its culture, its very essence. And he got it, all with a flair that would make any Hollywood director envious. Thebes fell, and with it, Pi secured his place in history as the Kushite pharaoh who conquered Egypt. But let's not get too starry-eyed here. The reality of Pi's conquest wasn't all glorious parades and divine favor. There was bureaucracy, lots of it. Running an empire, especially one as vast and complex as the new Kushite-Egyptian merger, was akin to juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle. Pi had to deal with local governors who were about as cooperative as cats at bath time, and the logistics of unifying two cultures that had spent centuries eyeing each other warily across the desert sands. Pi's reign is a testament to his vision and ambition, but it's also a reminder of the harsh realities of imperial governance. The economy under Pi's rule was a balancing act. Kush managed to keep the trade routes open and the gold flowing, but it wasn't without its challenges. The Nile was both a blessing and a curse. Its unpredictable flooding, a constant reminder that nature was the true ruler of these lands. What Pi achieved was nothing short of remarkable, a narrative of underdog triumph that resonates even today. He turned Kush from a kingdom into an empire and made it a power player in a region that had long been dominated by Egyptian grandeur. But he also laid the groundwork for the challenges that would come with such a rapid expansion. The bureaucracy, the need to maintain control over a diverse population, and the ever-present threat of rebellion were all part of the package deal. Even as we celebrate Pi's achievements, it's important to remember the price of empire. For every grand victory, there were countless logistical headaches, political machinations, and the unglamorous work of governance. Pi's story is one of ambition meeting reality, tale of triumph, tempered by the complexities of ruling an empire that spanned cultures and borders. So, as we leave Pi in the annals of history, let's appreciate the full picture. He was a visionary, a conqueror, and a ruler who dared to dream big in a world that was anything but forgiving. But he was also a man who understood the intricacies of power, the importance of legitimacy, and the necessity of a well-executed plan. Pi's legacy is one of daring and determination, a story that reminds us of the timeless allure and peril of conquest. And as the Kushite Empire reached its zenith, the stage was set for the next chapter in this fascinating saga, one where the echoes of Pi's reign would resonate for generations to come. With the stage set for Kush's grandeur, it's time to revel in the kingdom's golden age, where Meroe stood like a gleaming jewel in the desert sun. Picture it, a capital city bustling with the kind of energy that would make any ancient urban planner break into a cold sweat. Meroe wasn't just a place on the map. It was the heart of Kushite power and culture, a vibrant metropolis where art, commerce, and politics mingled like guests at a particularly lively cocktail party. Now, if you're imagining Meroe as some backwater outpost, think again. This was a city that had it all: strategic location, access to vital trade routes, and a flair for the dramatic. It was situated along the Nile, about 200 kilometers northeast of Khartoum in modern-day Sudan. This location was no accident. It was handpicked for its proximity to iron-rich deposits, making it the steel city of the ancient world. Talk about industrial chic. The Kushites had mastered the art of iron smelting, turning Meroe into a production powerhouse. Forget Silicon Valley. This was Iron Valley, where craftsmen toiled in the blazing heat to produce weapons, tools, and the kind of everyday items that kept the kingdom ticking. This mastery of ironworking wasn't just about keeping the economy humming. It was a strategic advantage that kept Kush competitive, both on the battlefield and in the marketplace. But let's not forget the piece de resistance of Kushite architecture, their iconic pyramids. Now, if your mind immediately drifts to the towering monuments of Giza, let's adjust the lens a bit. Kushite pyramids were the indie darlings of the pyramid world, smaller, steeper, and altogether more personal. With over 200 pyramids scattered across the landscape, these structures were more than just royal tombstones. They were cultural statements, a testament to the kingdom's enduring legacy. Constructing these architectural marvels wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Imagine the logistical nightmare of coordinating labor, materials, and time, all while under the relentless sun. These projects demanded precision and a workforce that could rival modern construction crews in efficiency. The pyramids of Meroe, distinct with their narrow bases and sharp angles, were the result of an ingenious balance between ambition and practicality. They were built using local sandstone, a resourceful choice that spoke to the Kushite knack for making the most of their environment. Of course, this boom in construction wasn't just about erecting fancy tombs. It was an economic engine, a way to keep artisans, laborers, and merchants employed, and the social fabric tightly woven. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Managing such projects was like herding cats if the cats were also trying to unionize and demand better working conditions. Maintaining control over the workforce required a deft hand and a keen understanding of human motivation, something that transcends the ages. Kush's cultural influence wasn't boxed in by stone and mortar, either. The kingdom was a melting pot of traditions, pulling influences from Egypt and farther afield. They had their own script, Meroitic, which remains one of history's tantalizing mysteries, as undeciphered as a toddler's crayon drawings. The Kushites also embraced a pantheon of gods, blending Egyptian deities with their own, creating a spiritual tapestry as rich and varied as their art. Economically, Meroe's prosperity was a double-edged sword, or perhaps a double-edged iron axe, in this case. As wealth flowed into the kingdom, The very things that made Kush enviable also painted a target on its back. The kingdom's riches in iron, gold, and ivory were irresistible to neighboring powers, like a pie cooling on a windowsill in a cartoon. Kush's prosperity was an open invitation for rival states to come knocking, not with neighborly casseroles, but with armies and ambitions. Yet, for all its external threats, the real dangers often lurked within. The administration of such vast resources required a bureaucracy that was as complex as it was necessary. Think of it as an ancient version of a tech support call center, where the stakes were higher and the wait times just as frustrating. Corruption and inefficiency could sap the kingdom's strength faster than any enemy army, and maintaining the delicate balance of power was a constant juggling act. Even at its zenith, the Kushite Empire was like a finely tuned instrument, capable of producing symphonies, but always at risk of going off-key. The rulers of Kush needed to be more than just figureheads. They were stewards of a legacy that demanded both vision and vigilance. With prosperity came the challenge of sustaining it, a task as monumental as the pyramids themselves. As Kush basked in its golden age, the echoes of its achievements resonated far beyond its borders. The kingdom's influence stretched into the cultural and economic spheres of neighboring regions, a testament to the enduring allure of a civilization that dared to dream big. But with great power came great responsibility, or at least the need for a really good defense strategy. The story of Kush is one of triumph and tenacity, where each victory was tempered by the challenges of maintaining an empire. It's a narrative that reminds us that history isn't just about the rise and fall of kingdoms. It's about the people who built them, the dreams they dared to chase, and the legacies they left behind. As we continue to explore the saga of Kush, remember that every peak has its precipice, and the journey is far from over. Ah, Kush, the kingdom that once strummed the strings of power like a virtuoso, now found itself facing the sour notes of decline. By around 300 BCE, the grand concert of Kushite civilization was starting to hit some discordant chords. And spoiler alert, it wasn't just because the musicians were out of tune. The decline of Kush was a symphony of internal strife, environmental changes, and some rather unfriendly neighbors who weren't content to play backup. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or in this case, the drought in the desert. The once reliable Nile, Kush's lifeline, decided to throw a wrench in the works with its unpredictable flooding patterns. These disruptions weren't just inconvenient, they were downright catastrophic. Imagine your kingdom's entire agricultural calendar, reliant on the Nile's whims, suddenly going haywire. It was like trying to host a picnic during a monsoon. Good luck keeping the sandwiches dry. These environmental shifts weren't just about soggy crops, though. They led to food shortages, which in turn sparked internal strife. As you might guess, people tend to get a bit testy when they are hungry. Famines struck, and with them came social unrest that could make a modern protest look like a Sunday stroll. The once thriving cities in Kush had to grapple with not just feeding their people, but also maintaining stability in the face of growing discontent. It's the sort of challenge that would have left any ruler reaching for the ancient equivalent of an aspirin. Meanwhile, the economic winds were shifting, and not in Kush's favor. Trade routes, those vital arteries of commerce, began to bypass Kush, trickling instead toward emerging powers like Axum. Picture Kush as the once bustling mall that suddenly finds itself overshadowed by a flashy new shopping center. The Axumite Empire, with its prime position along the Red Sea, was quickly becoming the new hot spot. Kush's trade, once the envy of the region, started to dry up faster than a puddle in the Sahara. And speaking of Axum, let's just say that neighborly relations were less than cordial. Picture two empires with all the warmth of rival siblings fighting over the last slice of cake. Axum wasn't content with just being the new kid on the block. It had ambitions of its own, ambitions that included Kush's lucrative resources. By the 4th century CE, Axumite King Ezana had his eyes set on Kush like a hawk eyeing its prey. And he wasn't just looking. He was moving in with the precision of a chess master. Ezana's conquest of Meray marked a pivotal moment in Kush's decline, a strategic checkmate that reshaped the balance of power in the region. But let's not forget the Romans, those perennial party crashers of the ancient world. Rome, with its insatiable appetite for expansion, had its own interests in the region. While Rome was more preoccupied with its Mediterranean playground, the mere presence of their influence was enough to keep Kush on its toes. Rome didn't directly conquer Kush, but its economic policies and military posturing influenced regional dynamics in ways that weren't exactly beneficial to the Kushites. Think of it as a cold war with more sand and fewer nukes. The internal politics of Kush were no less dramatic. The kingdom's rulers faced power struggles and succession crises that could rival any soap opera. As resources dwindled, so too did the unity among Kush's elite. Local governors, once loyal to the crown, began to act more like independent lords. The central authority weakened, and with it, the very fabric of Kushite society began to unravel. It was a classic case of too many cooks spoiling the broth, except the broth was an entire kingdom, and the cooks were power-hungry nobles. All these factors played out against a backdrop of cultural shifts. As the Kushites tried to navigate these turbulent waters, their connection to Egyptian traditions began to wane. The blending of cultures that once defined Kush's identity was now a source of tension. The Meroitic script, that enigmatic language of the Kushites, faded from common use, leaving behind mysteries that still baffle historians today. It's like the kingdom was writing its final chapter in a language no one could read. Yet, for all its challenges, the story of Kush's decline isn't just one of defeat. It's a tale of adaptation and resilience, of a civilization trying to hold on to its legacy in the face of overwhelming odds. The Kushites didn't just roll over and play dead. They fought to preserve their culture and autonomy, even as the sands of time threatened to bury them. In the end, the fall of Kush was less about a single catastrophic event and more about a slow erosion of power and influence. It was the cumulative effect of environmental changes, economic shifts, and political fragmentation, a perfect storm that even the mightiest of kingdoms would struggle to withstand. The legacy of Kush, however, didn't vanish with its decline. It lived on in the cultural imprints left across the region, in the echoes of its achievements, and in the lessons of resilience it taught. As we pause here, remember that the decline of Kush is more than just a historical footnote. It's a reminder of the fragility of power, the unpredictability of nature, and the complexities of human ambition. The story of Kush is far from over, and as we move forward, we'll continue to unravel the threads of this fascinating saga. Stay tuned, because the echoes of Kush still have tales to tell. And as we move forward, the curtain falls on Kush's last act around 350 CE, when the kingdom's final bow was met with the applause of time rather than an audience. The roots of Kush's downfall were as deep and tangled as a jungle vine, and the kingdom that once reigned supreme over the Nile's southern curl now found itself succumbing to the inexorable pull of history's tide. The city of Meroe, once a beacon of Kushite civilization, was now a shadow of its former self. Its decline wasn't the stuff of dramatic Hollywood epics with fiery sieges and last stands. Instead, it was a slow, quiet retreat, a dignified exit rather than an explosive finale. The Aksumite Empire, led by King Ezana, had effectively elbowed Kush off the stage, completing conquests that left Meroe a ghost town by the mid-4th century CE. Ezana's triumph was chronicled in the Jez script on a stele, boasting of his victory over Kush, as if he were announcing a particularly satisfying game of chess. But let's not give Aksum all the credit or blame. The slow erosion of Kush was also due to those pesky environmental factors. Climate change isn't just a modern dilemma. The ancient world had its own version of inconvenient truths. The desert encroached, the rains faltered, and what once was fertile land turned to dust, not unlike a bad breakup where the Nile just stopped texting back. These shifts left the agricultural backbone of Kush fractured and brittle, unable to support the weight of a population that was no longer thriving but merely surviving. Economic turmoil compounded the situation. With trade routes drying up like an unwatered cactus, Kush's once robust economy was gasping for air. Iron, ivory, and gold, the lifeblood of Kushite prosperity, became less of a commodity and more of a pipe dream as marketplaces shifted northward. The kingdom's coffers, once jingling with the profits of trans-Saharan trade, now echoed with the sound of empty promises and dwindling resources. Socially, the Kushites were facing dilemmas that might seem all too familiar today: political fragmentation, cultural shifts, and a populace questioning its leadership. The central authority of the Kandake, or queen, who was once a symbol of unifying power, found its influence waning. The rulers of Kush had been a matrilineal powerhouse with queens who weren't just arm candy, but active participants in governance. Yet, by the end of the Kushite kingdom, even these formidable women couldn't stave off the forces of change. As the kingdom faded, so too did its language. The Meroitic script, Kush's enigmatic code, drifted into obscurity, its secrets larked away like a lost treasure chest. Modern scholars are still scratching their heads over the undeciphered script, a linguistic puzzle that's as elusive as a cat avoiding a bath. The language of the Kushites may have fallen silent, but its echoes persist, tantalizing linguists with the promise of hidden stories. Now, let's address the myth-busting segment of our saga. Hollywood might envision Kush as a realm of glittering pyramids and sweeping deserts, with pharaohs striding about in gilded splendor. While the pyramids were indeed real, albeit smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, the reality was more nuanced. Kush was a complex tapestry woven from threads of trade, conflict, and adaptation. It wasn't a one-dimensional backdrop for an ancient epic. It was a living, breathing civilization with all the messiness that entails. The legacy of Kush is far from a dusty footnote in history. Its cultural imprints are scattered across the continent like breadcrumbs, leading us to modern Sudan, where the echoes of this ancient kingdom still resonate. The pyramids of Meroe stand as a testament to Kushite ingenuity, their silhouettes stark against the desert sky, reminding us that history isn't just about what we build, but what we leave behind. In today's world, where cultural identity is a hotbed of discussion, the story of Kush offers a poignant reminder of the resilience of human spirit and culture. The cyclical nature of empires is an age-old narrative. History is a never-ending play, with empires stepping into the spotlight only to exit as the curtains fall. Kush is a chapter in this grand tome, a reminder that the rise and fall of civilizations are as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Each empire wears a different costume, but dances to the same tune, a melody of ambition, hubris, and adaptation. As we wrap up our journey through the rise and fall of the kingdom of Kush, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons etched in its history. Empires may crumble, but their stories endure, whispered through the ruins they leave behind. Kush wasn't just a footnote in Egypt's story. It was a vibrant narrative in its own right, a testament to the power of resilience and the complexity of cultural identity. In the grand narrative of history, Kush stands as a reminder that every empire, no matter how mighty, is subject to the whims of time and nature. But unlike the sands that cover its ancient cities, the legacy of Kush refuses to be buried. Instead, it persists, a testament to the enduring power of human creativity and tenacity. As we bid farewell to the kingdom of Kush, we remember that history is always in the making, and the echoes of the past continue to shape the world of today.